It started as an ordinary storm, gray skies, wet pavement, a quiet street. Then a door slammed, leaving a little girl barefoot and alone on the porch as rain poured down. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, torn between fear of overstepping and the sick twist in their stomachs as the child trembled. One by one, decisions were made. Umbrellas opened, phones raised, voices called out. What happened next spread far beyond Maple Street. A rescue, a reckoning, and a vow that changed the town forever. Would you have stayed safe inside or stepped into the storm? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Gray pressed low over Maple Street, turning the sky to heavy pewter that promised more than drizzle. Porch lights began to blink on one by one, as though the houses themselves sensed what was coming. Rain gathered first in gentle spits, then steadier drops that darkened the old asphalt and traced silver trails down the cracked concrete walks. The air smelled of wet leaves and summer's end. Everything had the hushed waiting of a small neighborhood about to settle in for the night. Then the slam of a door cut through the damp quiet. She stood there alone, thin, barefoot, knees pale against the dark porch wood. Lila clutched a backpack that looked older than she was, one strap frayed and knotted to keep from unraveling. A thin sweater clung to her shoulders, already wet where rain slicked down her hair in long, uneven ropes. Behind the closed door came a single muffled voice, sharp and too quick to make out words. Another sound followed. A chair scraped, a cupboard closed, and then nothing at all. She knocked once, small fist against painted wood. The sound was swallowed by the storm building its rhythm. She tried again, harder this time, voice a little hoarse from crying. "Mom!" The word barely made it past the weather. It might have been for herself more than for anyone inside. Across the street, the Alvarez living room flickered with television light. Mrs. Alvarez stood halfway to the kitchen, remote in one hand, and paused. At first, it was only movement glimpsed through water-blurred glass, a child where no child should be at this hour. She drew the curtain back a few inches, frown deepening as the drizzle sharpened into real rain. 2 doors down, Mr. Givens was setting a mug in the sink when he heard what sounded like a knock carried by wind. He stepped to his own window and saw the girl on the porch, small and alone, hair plaster flat, one bare foot tucked up to her shin for warmth. Inside the Doyle house, there was a faint thump, then silence so deliberate it felt like listening to a heartbeat hold still. The porch light blinked out with a click, plunging the girl into deeper shadow and letting the storm claim her completely. She tried the handle anyway, twisting it until her hand slipped. A sob, or maybe just a breath escaped. She sank down onto the top step, pulling the damp sweater tighter. Rain pattered against her shoulders. The backpack sagged, water seeping into worn canvas. Mrs. Alvarez's hand hovered over her phone. She thought of calling right then, but something, fear of making trouble, not wanting to assume, made her hesitate. Instead, she typed a short message to the neighborhood chat. Asterisk, anyone else seeing this? Kid on Doyle porch. Asterisk blue bubbles blinked back as people read, paused, answered. Eli and Jonah, teenage brothers across the street, leaned out their attic window for a better look. Their game paused mid-match. "It's that Doyle girl," Jonah whispered. "She's locked out." Eli didn't answer right away, just frowned and reached for his phone. Thunder rolled somewhere far enough away to feel more like warning than threat, but the rain thickened. It soaked through the girl's thin sweater until her shoulders hunched forward, chin nearly to her knees. Each time a car passed at the far end of the street, headlights caught her for a moment, a child alone in the rain, before sliding away into darkness again. Mr. Gibbons stood at his doorway longer than he should have, arguing with himself in silence. Then he reached for the umbrella by the shoe rack and stepped into the night. The wind turned it inside out once before he fought it steady and started across the lawn toward the little figure. The houses around them watched in half-light, blinds tilted, curtains shifted. Maple Street had seen storms before, seen neighbor kids play until the street lamps hummed on, but this was different. The hush had weight. Even the rain seemed to fall quieter as the man approached the girl, as if the night itself held breath. She looked up when his shoes reached the bottom step, face blotched from cold and crying, eyes wide and searching. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to make his voice gentle enough not to scare. "You okay?" She shook her head without speaking. He saw then how young she was. Younger than he thought at first, maybe 9, maybe 10, and how small she seemed swallowed by that sodden sweater. The door behind her stayed silent, the house dark and still. From somewhere across the street, another curtain slid back. Phones glowed faintly in palms. In one attic window, Jonah held his phone up, filming in shaky secrecy, part fear, part instinct to record what might matter later. Rainwater ran in small rivers along the curb and over Mr. Given's shoes as he tried the door himself, knocking firmly but not hard. "Karen? It's Rob. Open up." Only wind and rain answered. And in that moment, Maple Street shifted from quiet neighborhood to witness. Something fragile had broken, and everyone could feel it. One by one, small rectangles of light opened along Maple Street, as if the houses themselves had taken notice. Curtains shifted an inch at a time, hesitant hands testing how much could be seen without being seen. Mrs. Alvarez was first. She stood in her darkened front room, the television on mute now, her fingers curled around the fabric of the drape. She had been about to carry her empty mug to the sink when she caught sight of the little figure across the way. The girl sat hunched and wet on the Doyle porch, shoulders drawn up tight, hair clinging like seaweed to her face. Mrs. Alvarez stayed half hidden behind the curtain, uneasy. She thought of her own grown children, how easily harm would come when no one paid attention. Next door, Rob Given stood still at his front window. His house smelled of coffee and floor polish, quiet but for the hum of his refrigerator. He'd seen the door slam earlier, had heard something muffled but didn't piece it together until now. His breath made a pale fog on the glass as he tried to make out details through rain beating and streaming down the pane. The girl wasn't moving much, just clutching the bag, her chin low. He recognized the child now, Lila Doyle. He'd waved her a few times when she walked to school. Always shy, always a small nod and nothing more. Up higher, at the slanted roof window of the big white house with peeling trim, 2 boys crouched side by side. Jonah, 14 and restless, had pulled the window latch as soon as he saw Mrs. Alvarez standing still and looking out. Eli, a year younger but taller, leaned forward for a better view, his breath catching when he saw the small barefoot figure across the street. Their game controller lay abandoned on the carpet behind them. Jonah held his phone ready, camera lens smudged but open, almost without thinking. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to record, just that something about the sight didn't feel ordinary. Rain deepened, tapping hard against glass and roof shingles. In the houses where curtains hadn't moved yet, light flickered from televisions and lamps, but no one had decided to look. Some didn't want to be caught peering. Others convinced themselves it was none of their business. But across 3 houses, silent communication began, the kind that lives in glances and half gestures. Mrs. Alvarez pulled her phone from the pocket of her cardigan, screen lighting her face in blue. She typed into the neighborhood chat, fingers slightly trembling. Asterisk, anyone else see the Doyle kid outside? Looks soaked. Asterisk. Jonah's phone buzzed almost at once with the same alert. Their mother's group chat overlapped with the street watch thread. Eli leaned closer, reading upside down. Should we check? Mrs. Alvarez's bubble hung there, unanswered. Then another ping came. Maybe it's just a timeout. Another. Kid's fine, I'm sure. Words meant to push responsibility elsewhere. Rob Given stayed at the glass longer than the others. He rubbed a palm across his face and told himself someone else would step in. Then he thought of last winter, when the Doyle furnace failed, and no one checked until morning. He'd seen the repair truck and thought, next time I'll help. Now here was next time, right there in the rain. Upstairs, Jonah said softly, she's been out there a while. His voice didn't carry far, but the weight of it filled the small attic. Eli swallowed. Should we? Jonah shook his head, eyes flicking to the dark window of the Doyle house. Mom says don't get mixed up in their stuff. But his thumb hovered over the record button anyway. Something about proof felt safer than silence. Back in her front room, Mrs. Alvarez paced a short line between the curtain and the hall. She tried to remember if she had Karen Doyle's number. Maybe she could text and pretend to borrow sugar, anything to check. But the thought of confrontation, of Karen's sharp tongue that once cut a grocery clerk in half over coupons. Stopped her. She went back to the chat. Asterisk, this isn't right. Someone should help. Asterisk, no reply came this time. Only the blinking dots of people typing and then stopping. Rain streaked heavier, filling gutters, pooling at the curb. The girl shifted, hugging her knees tighter. Her thin sweater plastered to her back. Jonah's phone captured it all silently. The bent head, the tremor of shoulders, the way her bare foot tapped restlessly against wet wood. Somewhere inside the Doyle house a light flickered on, then went dark again. No movement otherwise. In the quiet before someone acts, a strange tension forms. Part fear, part guilt. Mrs. Alvarez could feel it. Rob Givens felt it pressing between his shoulder blades. Eli felt it so sharply his stomach hurt. It was a space where help should already have been moving, but hadn't. Rob finally stepped back from the window, jaw tight. He pulled on his raincoat, found the umbrella, and shoved his phone in his pocket. Behind him, his empty house didn't protest or advise. It just stayed quiet, leaving the choice to him. When the door latch clicked and he stepped into the wet night, several curtains fluttered and stilled. Watching had changed to witnessing, and witnessing was just one small step from action. Rain slid in shimmering sheets across the porch roof, spilling down onto the warped planks where Lila stood. Her sweater clung so tightly now it was more a second skin than clothing. Cold found every seam and seam split. She lifted her fist and knocked again. The sound was small against the weight of weather, a light thud swallowed by wind and water. Still, she tried once more, knuckles reddened from the effort, breath coming fast and shallow. "Mom!" she called, softer than she meant, a voice frayed from earlier shouting and quiet sobs that had followed. Inside, only silence answered. The house had gone still in a way that felt deliberate. A shadow moved once beyond the frosted glass panel, then vanished as if retreating deeper. A moment later the porch light flickered, buzzed faintly, and snapped off, plunging everything into murk and shadow. The single cruel click of that switch felt heavier than a shout. She turned the handle, knowing it was locked, but trying anyway, twisting until her wet fingers slipped and left faint streaks of mud on the brass. Her small frame pressed forward, as if weight alone might change the outcome. The door gave nothing back, not even a rattle. Whoever was inside had secured it tight. The rain, no longer a drizzle, hammered harder, drumming on gutters and pavement, drowning out the softer sounds of the neighborhood. Water pooled around her bare toes until she stood in a shallow, freezing puddle. She pulled the backpack closer, but it had gone limp and sodden. The papers inside, drawings, homework, had begun to bleed ink in slow blue swirls. She didn't cry loudly now. Her face had gone still except for the tremor at her lower lip. Across the street, a glow brightened where Mrs. Alvarez still hovered at her front window. She couldn't hear the knocking but saw the motion. Small hand, door unmoved, shoulders hunching tighter. She pressed a palm to the glass without realizing it, as if that could somehow pass warmth through distance. Next door, Rob Givens had made it halfway down his porch steps when he stopped. He heard the knocking clearly now, quick and desperate in the break between thunder and rain. Each knock sounded less like anger and more like plea. Something twisted in his chest. A father's reflex that never quite went away even though his own kids were long grown. Up above, Jonah whispered to Eli, "She's knocking again." They could see just enough, the slanted yellow glow from their bedroom spilling across the attic floor, making silhouettes of their heads against the pane. Jonah's phone kept rolling though his hands had started to shake. The thought of filming felt strange now, maybe wrong, but he couldn't seem to stop. Why doesn't she just let her in? Eli asked quietly, but there was no answer. The sky flashed with distant lightning, blue-white for an instant, catching the raindrops like glass beads and throwing Lila into stark relief, a small, drenched shape against the dark house. The thunder that followed rolled heavy and low, rattling windows. She flinched, then steadied herself, though her breath came faster. Mrs. Alvarez typed another message. She's still outside, but again, the chat stayed mostly gray and silent. People read and didn't reply. Somewhere down the block a curtain twitched shut. Another set of lights turned off entirely, as if retreating from involvement. Rob stepped off his last stair onto the lawn, umbrella angling forward to block the rain. He told himself again that maybe there was reason, maybe this was discipline, and not danger, but the thought rang hollow now. A child shouldn't look like that, curled and wet, pleading at a locked door. Lila knocked one last time, 3 quick raps, as though some part of her still believed the door might open if she just asked right. Then she let her arm drop and pressed her forehead to the wood. Her breath fogged the paint faintly before the storm snatched the warmth away. From his vantage, Jonah zoomed in, catching the tiny moment, the way she leaned in, surrendering for just a second before straightening again. "She's freezing," he whispered, and Eli swallowed hard. Rob's boots squelched in the grass as he stepped closer, and Mrs. Alvarez left her window entirely, grabbing the spare throw blanket from her couch. Both moved slowly, but with decision now. The unspoken had cracked. No more hoping someone else would solve it. The locked door loomed large in the storm, a line drawn not just between mother and daughter, but between safety and harm. Behind it, Karen Doyle stayed hidden. Her presence felt only by the pointed silence she maintained. Every second she refused to answer hardened the air, turned curiosity into alarm. The rain shifted direction with the wind, a sudden gust sending cold spray across the porch and driving Lila back a step. She sniffed once, rubbed her face with the heel of her hand, then glanced sideways at the movement of a man and an umbrella drawing near. Rob saw her eyes, wide and dark and stunned, and felt something settle in him. If the door wouldn't open, someone else would have to. He called her name softly so as not to scare, but also loud enough to reach whatever waited behind that sealed house. The rain lost its gentle patter and turned hard, sudden, like a sheet pulled tight across the whole street. It hit the porch roof so loudly that conversation inside any house would have to pause to hear it. Water began to run in quick, busy streams along the curb, gathering fallen leaves and cigarette ends, carrying them in small brown whirlpools toward the storm drain at the corner. Each drop struck colder than the one before, autumn pushing summer out without permission. Lila slid down another inch until she sat fully on the top step, knees pulled close, the sodden sweater doing nothing now. Her bare toes curled inward against the wood, as if she could somehow climb inside herself and get warm. She tucked her chin behind her knees and let the backpack slump against her hip. The rainwater had soaked through the bottom. Paper edges curled and bled blue and red from pens and markers. She didn't try the door again. It stood above her like something alive and unmovable, paint glossy with rain, brass knobs slick and cold. Inside, there was no yelling anymore, no footsteps. The silence behind that door felt worse than the earlier shouting, heavier, deliberate, like a decision had been made, and now nothing would change it. Each time the wind shifted and flung cold spray across the porch, she flinched but stayed still, small and waiting. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez was back at her window. She'd thrown on a cardigan and turned off the living room light so she could see better out into the dark. The girl was no longer knocking, just folded up small, hair plastered flat to her neck. The sight tightened something in her chest. She thought of her own Rosa, once 10 and quiet, who used to wait on their porch after school when she forgot her key. That memory hurt in a way she hadn't expected. She reached for her phone again, but didn't press call yet. Next door, Rob Givens had crossed halfway up the Doyle's walk before stopping. The umbrella tugged and shuddered in the wind. Rain had already darkened his jeans to the knee. He looked at the still figure, then at the door. His throat worked as he swallowed words he hadn't decided to speak. He had the odd, sharp thought that this moment was heavier than it looked, that years later people would say where they were when it happened. He didn't know what it was yet, only that it was building. Upstairs in the White House, Jonah's phone kept rolling. The screen jumped and trembled from his shaking hands. "She's just sitting there now," he whispered to Eli. His brother leaned closer, eyes wide. Both boys pressed so near the glass their breath fogged it. "She's freezing," Eli murmured back. They didn't know if they were talking to each other or convincing themselves that what they saw was real and not just some family argument that would end any second with the door opening in laughter or apology. But the door stayed shut. Wind swept down Maple Street, rattling garbage bins and slapping a loose shutter against a brick wall somewhere. The air smelled of wet wood and damp earth. A piece of someone's newspaper tumbled across the road and caught against Lila's leg. She didn't move to brush it away. Mrs. Alvarez finally left the window. She moved with decision now, pulling on boots and fishing for an umbrella of her own. Fear and hesitation had worn thin. Whatever was happening behind that door could not be worse than what was happening out here to a child alone. Rob shifted his weight, stepped closer until he was only a yard from the girl. "Hey!" he said, voice raised just enough to cut through the storm but still gentle. She startled slightly and looked up. Her cheeks were splotched red from cold. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide and uncertain. She didn't answer but also didn't back away. "Anyone home?" he called toward the door, knocking once with the back of his hand. Umbrella tilting over them both now. The sound was lost almost instantly in the downpour, but he tried again, harder. Still no answer, no light, no shape moving inside. The street felt different now, as though each watching house had drawn a breath. Curtains stirred faintly. Porch lights blinked on one, then two. Neighbors testing distance. Try to gauge if stepping forward was allowed. The chat on Mrs. Alvarez's phone lit with new messages, short and urgent. "Call? What's going on? Still out there?" Lila pressed closer to the umbrella's shadow, without meaning to. Rob didn't reach for her. He only shifted so the worst of the rain broke on his shoulder instead of hers. They waited like that for a long moment, one adult, one child, and a silent house behind them. The storm cracked wide with thunder, and lights flickered along the block. Jonah flinched hard, but his camera kept rolling. "We should do something," Eli whispered. Jonah didn't answer, because doing something meant crossing a line. They weren't sure kids were allowed to cross. Mrs. Alvarez's boots hit the sidewalk, splashing through growing rivers. She clutched a thick blanket to her chest. From several yards away, she called softly, "Sweetheart, you cold?" Lila turned her head, unsure, but didn't run. Rain poured harder, bending the umbrella in Rob's grip. Still the door did nothing. No voice, no latch, no apology or explanation. Just silence, heavy and unbroken, while the storm turned the night raw and metallic. And somewhere deep inside that silence, everyone who could see knew it was no longer a private family matter. It had shifted into something the street itself was about to claim. Mrs. Alvarez stood in the glow of her phone, the rain-muted world outside still framed by the narrow slit in her curtains. Her thumb hovered above the keyboard for a long time before she tapped the first words. "Anyone else seeing this?" She stared at the small gray bubble after sent, hoping someone would answer quickly and confirm she wasn't overreacting. The typing dots blinked, stopped, blinked again, then vanished. Silence. The longer she waited, the more the storm seemed to push against her windows, reminding her of the girl still curled on that porch. The house around her was dark, except for the TV screen pause mid-show. She turned it off and listened. The rain's roar softened everything but her own heartbeat. She added another message before she could think herself out of it. Asterisk, she's been out there a while. Looks freezing. Asterisk. On the other side of Maple Street. Jonah's phone vibrated on the windowsill. He jumped at the sound even though he'd been waiting for it, eyes locked on the wet figure. Eli leaned in and read aloud, voice low but urgent. Mrs. had just asked if anyone's seeing her. Jonah typed with shaking fingers. Asterisk, yeah, we see her. She's locked out. Asterisk, he hit send before he could reconsider. A new ping came from further down the block where the Carters lived. Maybe just punishment? That one stung Mrs. Alvarez more than she expected. She typed back fast. Asterisk, she's soaked. No shoes. This isn't right. Asterisk, then she hesitated. Looking out again at the girl. So small she almost disappeared against the dark wood of the house. More messages flickered in, overlapping and contradictory. Don't get involved. Should we call someone? Karen probably mad about something. Each line felt like the street wrestling with itself, caution pulling against conscience. In his kitchen doorway, Rob Gibbons felt his own phone buzz in his pocket. He'd forgotten it was there until now. He fished it out with one wet hand and saw the thread unfolding. Mrs. Alvarez's first text sat at the top, Jonah's confirmation below it. He stared at the screen and saw his own hesitation mirrored in the hesitant phrases of his neighbors. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then he typed, Asterisk, I'm outside. She's freezing. Door locked. Asterisk, he hit send. Almost instantly, responses burst through the chat like sparks. What do you mean locked? She's just a kid. Call 911. Rob read them without replying, his other hand steadying the umbrella over Lila's small form. She hadn't spoken, but her head had lifted just enough to look at him once, quick and uncertain. Upstairs, Jonah filmed and read at the same time, adrenaline buzzing in his chest. The group chat felt alive. Faster now, no longer ignoring what was happening. His phone dinged again, his mom, in a private message. You boys stay inside. He didn't answer. Eli glanced at him, nervous but refusing to pull back from a window. Mrs. Alvarez typed with hands that shook. I'm going over. But before she could hit send, she saw through the watery glass that Rob was already there, umbrella tilting, body blocking the rain. She deleted the text and replaced it with, Rob's there now. Farther down the thread, someone new joined. Nurse Daniels from 2 doors away. Asterisk on my way. I've got blankets. Asterisk that sent a small wave of relief through Mrs. Alvarez, though she didn't know why. Just seeing someone decisive steadied her own heart. For a moment, the chat went quiet again, as if everyone was waiting for the story to change. But outside, the house remained lifeless. Rain hammered on gutters and splashed off the step where Lila sat. Rob's umbrella trembled under a gust of wind, but held. Jonah's phone buzzed with another private text, this time from his friend Sam across town. Asterisk, what's happening at your place? Saw your snap. Asterisk, Jonah hadn't realized he posted. Maybe his finger hit share by accident. Too late now. The image was out, a small hunch figure under rain, captionless. He shoved the phone in his pocket, guilt and relief mixing in a way he didn't understand. Mrs. Alvarez set her phone down, just long enough to tug on her boots and find the old army green raincoat from the back closet. Her fingers kept returning to the phone, though, checking and rechecking the thread. People were watching. People were worried. It didn't make her feel better. It made her want to move. Rob's next message came short and clear. Asterisk, no answer. Knocking, nothing. Asterisk. That one seemed to change the air. Notifications flared faster. Call now. Call non-emergency at least. This isn't okay. Someone posted the local police line. Someone else typed, I'm calling. Across the road, Jonah and Eli both looked up at the sound of their mother's hurried steps on the stairs. Phones, she said sharply as she came into the room. Now. They obeyed, but Jonah's heart hammered. Part of him was glad, part angry to lose the feed. Mrs. Alvarez pressed the call icon with cold fingers. She turned from the window as the dispatcher answered, giving the address with careful, deliberate clarity. Her voice only shook once when she said, There's a child outside, locked out in the storm. While she spoke, another ping lit the screen. From Nurse Daniels again, I'm almost there. And then, seconds later, a new message from an unknown number, maybe a neighbor further down the street. Asterisk recording too. Just in case. Asterisk. The quiet, watching street had turned itself into a network. Screens glowing. Worry passing from house to house faster than feet could move. It wasn't rescue yet, but it was no longer silence. And for the first time all evening, the dark door at the center of everything was surrounded not by emptiness, but by witnesses gathering. If only first through words and light. Rob Given stood just inside his doorway. One hand braced against the frame while rain hissed and pooled outside. He'd been watching for long minutes, trying to believe it was none of his business, that someone else would take care of it. His phone buzzed with a neighborhood thread, messages stacking up, half worry, half rationalization, but the screen felt useless now. He stared instead at the girl hunched on the steps across the wet grass, small enough that the storm nearly swallowed her whole. His house was warm behind him. The scent of fresh coffee still lingered in the hall, but the sight of Lila curled under the eaves kept tugging him forward, the way an old memory might. His own daughter when she was 9, stubborn and scared after slamming a door she couldn't reopen, the time he almost didn't go after her. He took a breath that tasted like guilt and rain and stepped fully onto the porch. The umbrella leaned in its usual place by the shoe rack. He grabbed it, shaking water from its edges before flicking it open. The wind caught at once and almost turned inside out. He wrestled it steady, jaw set, Somewhere behind him, his phone buzzed again. More messages, a question mark, someone typing, but he ignored it and moved down the stairs into the rain. The cold hit fast, sliding down the back of his neck and soaking his collar. By the time he reached the walkway, his jeans clung heavy to his legs. He paused once at the edge of his yard, scanning the Doyle house. Every window was dark except one upstairs, faint blue flicker that vanished as quick as it came. The porch light stayed dead. Rob shifted the umbrella forward like a shield and started across the narrow street. Water slicked the asphalt to a mirror shine, reflecting street lamps and his own hunched shadow. The sound of the rain swallowed his footsteps, but in his ears his heart pounded loud enough to feel. When he reached the curb in front of the Doyle place, he slowed, giving her space. "Hey!" he called, voice careful and low so it wouldn't sound like a threat. The girl didn't look up right away. Her arms stayed wrapped tight around her legs. Rain dripped from her hair and chin, soaking the sweater until it clung to her ribs. He took one more step, close enough now to offer the umbrella's small island of dryness. She flinched at first when the shadow passed over her, but then glanced sideways. Her eyes were enormous and glassy, too old and too young at the same time. "You cold?" he asked softly. She didn't answer, just blinked rain from her lashes. Her lips trembled but stayed shut. Rob looked at the door behind her, raised his voice enough to carry through the storm. "Karen?" His knuckles tapped the wood, not hard but steady. "It's Rob from next door." "You there?" No answer. He tried again, a little louder this time. "She's getting soaked out here." Nothing but the scrape of branches and the shiver of the downspout spilling water. The silence behind that door wasn't just absence. It felt deliberate, like someone choosing not to move. He felt the weight of every second, the cameras behind curtains, the phones buzzing with half-formed questions. He wasn't looking for heroics. He just couldn't stand the sight of a child left to the weather. So he stayed there, a barrier between her and the storm for the moment, umbrella dripping down his arm. From across the street, a faint glow told him Mrs. Alvarez was watching. Further down, another porch light blinked on, hesitant but curious. Witnesses growing bolder now that someone had stepped first. Rob crouched slightly, careful not to spook the girl. "I'm just trying to help," he said, quieter again. "You want to come stand under this with me?" For a moment she didn't move, then a tiny shift, enough to bring her shoulder just inside the arc of the umbrella. She didn't let go of her knees or the soaked backpack, but she let a little warmth in. "Good," he murmured, mostly to himself. "That's good." He adjusted his stance. So the rain hit him and not her. Cold seeped into his back and shoulders, but it didn't matter. Behind him, another door opened. The sound was soft but clear. Mrs. Alvarez's boot stepping out, her umbrella still furled under her arm, a thick blanket over the other. She called across the rain, "Rob, you okay?" He nodded but didn't turn fully. "She's freezing," he said loud enough for her to hear. "Nobody's coming." The words floated back across the water-slick street and seemed to move something unseen. Curtains that had been closed shifted again. A car engine shut off somewhere. It felt as though the whole street had been waiting for a signal and now had won. Still, the house stayed dark and silent. Rob glanced once more at the door, rain dripping from his hair, and felt anger slide under the worry. Not a shout, just a slow burn at the idea that anyone could leave a child out here like this. But he pushed it down. Right now it wasn't for anger. It was for making sure she was safe until someone with authority arrived. He checked the phone in his pocket without moving the umbrella. Messages stacked, new names appearing in the thread. Nurse Daniel saying she was on her way. Others asking if police had been called. He typed one-handed, *, I'm with her. Still no response. *, then he slipped it away and stood taller, keeping the umbrella fixed overhead while the storm poured on. It wasn't a rescue, not yet, but it was something. One man stepping out, deciding quiet witness was enough, making a small island of safety under a thin black canopy. On Maple Street, that first move was enough to shift the whole night. Rain hammered the umbrella until the fabric bowed and shuddered over Rob's head, but he leaned lower and squinted through the shifting curtain of water. Now that he was close enough to see her properly, the picture sharpened into something worse than a child caught in the rain. Lila's face was streaked not just with water, but the pale, blotchy signs of crying that had gone on too long. Her eyes flicked up at him, wide and startled, before sliding down again as though bracing for trouble. He followed the tremor of her small hands gripping the backpack. One strap was broken, ripped clear at the seam, and knotted back in a crude, tight tangle. The fabric sagged heavy with water, one side torn open just enough for the edge of a paper folder to stick out, ink curling and bleeding blue into the brown canvas. Her sweater hung crooked, one sleeve stretched longer than the other as if it had been yanked. And where he expected two small shoes, there was only one, a pink sneaker, soaked and darkened with mud, the other foot bare, toes clenched white against the wet wood. Rob felt something cold slide deeper into his chest than any rain could reach. He'd told himself on the walk over that this might be some ordinary punishment, a too harsh timeout gone wrong. But nothing about her now looked ordinary. This wasn't defiance, it was defeat. He lowered himself a little, trying to come down to her level, though the old knees complained. "Hey!" he said again, softer, trying to find a tone that didn't sound like questions or orders. "You hurt?" She shook her head quickly, but he didn't believe it. She kept one hand tucked under the sweater, near her ribs, protective. From somewhere behind him, boots splashed. Mrs. Alvarez moving closer now with her blanket bundled tight. "She's just a baby," Mrs. Alvarez muttered under her breath, voice trembling with something between fear and anger. Rob didn't look back, but the sound steadied him, proof he wasn't imagining how bad this was. He turned slightly and called toward the house again. "Karen, she's freezing out here. Enough now." His knuckles rapped the door, harder this time, umbrella shifting but holding. "Open up." The noise was swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Nothing stirred beyond the painted wood. The girl flinched at the knock. Instinct, maybe. Rob stopped at once, pulling back so he wouldn't scare her. Sorry, he murmured. "It's okay." He adjusted the umbrella to cover more of her small frame, feeling the cold water soak deeper into his shoulder where the canopy no longer reached. Mrs. Alvarez reached the bottom step and crouched halfway, careful and slow like approaching a wild animal. "Hi, honey," she said gently, voice pitched to be warm without coaxing too hard. "It's just us, your neighbors." She held out the blanket in silent offer. Lila hesitated, eyes darting from one adult to the other, then to the door behind her. She didn't take the blanket, but didn't retreat either. Her lips parted like she might speak, but nothing came out, only a faint, shaky breath. A gust of wind flung cold rain sideways across all three of them. Rob's umbrella bucked and nearly turned, and he had to fight it steady. When he glanced sideways, he caught more movement. Another curtain lifting across the street, silhouettes forming in lit windows. People were watching, drawn closer by what they saw. The quiet network of neighbors woken by Mrs. Alvarez's first text was taking shape in real life. Mrs. Alvarez whispered to Rob, "She's terrified." "I know," he said, eyes still locked on the girl. He wanted to ask her name, though he already knew it. He wanted to say something that would cut through the fear. Instead, he tried, "You want to stand up? We can move over to my porch. Get dry just for a minute." The girl shook her head, quick and tiny. Not trust yet, but not running. From the dark house behind her came a single faint sound, a creak like a floorboard, then nothing. The silence pressed heavier, deliberate and watching. Rob stared at the door a long second, the muscles in his jaw knotting. He'd seen plenty of parenting done wrong, but this felt different. A boundary crossed, a cruelty deep enough to turn rain into something more dangerous. Mrs. Alvarez tried a different approach, keeping her eyes soft. "Sweetheart, you're safe with us," she said, holding the blanket open wider, a quiet half-circle of warmth. "Just want to keep you warm until your mom opens the door." Lila's shoulders trembled, whether from cold or holding back more tears. Rob couldn't tell. He could see she was weighing something, some inner scale of risk and hope. Another flash of lightning broke overhead, bright enough to make her wince and squeeze eyes shut. When she opened them again, they landed on Mrs. Alvarez, and for the first time her face cracked. Not a full sob, just a wet, exhausted look that asked nothing and said everything. Rob felt the anger come back, slow and low but undeniable. This was not weather. This was neglect, humiliation, fear. He looked at Mrs. Alvarez and saw the same recognition in her eyes. Without speaking, they both seemed to agree on the next truth. Whatever this had started as inside the house, it no longer belonged to one parent's temper. Behind them, a car door slammed. Someone else stepping out now. Shapes gathered at the edge of driveways, umbrellas sprouting like cautious mushrooms in the storm. The network of texts had turned to feet and faces. And under the thin shelter of his umbrella, Rob shifted just enough to stand between the child and the dark doorway, making it clear the night had witnesses and would not quietly hand her back into harm. Jonah had never meant to be brave. He told himself that when he first lifted his phone, palms damp from nerves rather than rain. The window latch was stubborn from years of paint, but it shoved it up anyway and let the cool night air sweep in, carrying the smell of wet pavement and leaf rot. From here, he could see everything. The little figure hunched on the Doyle porch, Mr. Gibbons standing awkward and protective under his umbrella, Mrs. Alvarez inching closer with her blanket. It was a scene too quiet for how wrong it felt, like a picture you wanted to look away from but couldn't. The phone felt heavier than usual. Jonah's thumb had hovered above the red circle for a long second before pressing it down. The camera opened and the world shrank into a trembling rectangle. Rain jittering in the dark, the black shine of soaked wood, Lila's tiny frame pulled on itself. He zoomed a little, careful not to lose focus, careful not to breathe too loud in case it somehow carried across the street. Eli was crouched beside him, knees digging into the carpet, face close to the glass. His voice came as a whisper Jonah almost didn't hear. Get help. Jonah didn't look away from the screen. I am, he whispered back, though his hand said otherwise, shaking so badly the picture blurred and steadied and blurred again. No, I mean like, real help, Eli hissed. Call or text someone who's awake. Jonah glanced at the group thread on his other screen. It was still lighting up every few seconds. Messages stacked. Someone call Rob's with her police? He swallowed. They're already on it. That's not the same as you calling, Eli said. His voice was tight, not angry, but scared in the way younger siblings get when something adult and unpredictable is happening. What if no one actually does? Jonah didn't answer because the question landed too close to the worry in his own chest. Instead, he steadied the camera again, zooming back out, so the frame caught Mr. Gibbons and Mrs. Alvarez moving toward the girl. The rain streaked the image in silver threads. Lila didn't move much, but when a fresh gust hit, she shivered so violently the picture seemed to shake too. Why is she not going inside? Eli whispered, still pressed to the glass. Why is her mom? He cut himself off like saying it would make it worse. Jonah didn't know the answer. He'd heard yelling earlier, muffled by distance, and then the slam of the door. They'd looked at each other when it happened, but hadn't gone to the window until Mrs. Alvarez posted. Now everything felt heavier than just bad temper. There was a cruelty in how long the girl had been left out there. Across the way, Mrs. Alvarez took another cautious step, blanket stretched in both arms. Rob leaned slightly to shield the girl with his umbrella. Jonah filmed it all, partly to keep his hands busy, partly because something deep inside said they might need proof later. Not gossip, not something for kids at school to pass around, but evidence if someone ever asked what happened and grown-ups tried to smooth it over. His phone buzzed hard against his palm, nearly making him drop it. A message from his mom. Asterisk, stay inside. Do not go over there. Asterisk, he typed back without looking, we're inside, and didn't add that they were also watching and recording. Show me, Eli said. Jonah angled the screen toward him. The younger boy's face twisted. Fear, maybe anger too. She's missing a shoe, he said quietly, as if naming it made it worse. She's soaked through. She gonna get sick. Jonah swallowed and thought the last time he'd been sick himself, how his mom had wrapped him in blankets and fed him toast. That girl had nothing. No warm light behind her. No arms waiting to pull her inside. Down on the street, a new movement caught his eye. A neighbor 2 houses down stepping onto a porch. Phone pressed his ear, scanning the street as if confirming details. Another curtain open on the corner house, a silhouette peeking out. The quiet watchers were multiplying, and Jonah's chest loosened just slightly. It wasn't enough, but it wasn't nothing. Eli tugged at his sleeve. Jonah, what if her mom comes out mad? At Mr. Givens? Jonah kept filming, but found himself nodding. Then we have it, he said, surprising himself at how sure it sounded. We have proof. The word proof settled heavy between them. They weren't used to thinking like that, but something about the night demanded it. Lightning flickered again, illuminating everything in stark white. Rob's damp hair plastered his forehead, Mrs. Alvarez's coat flapping in the gusts, Lila's tiny frame huddled tighter, as though bracing for both weather and whatever came after. When darkness returned, Jonah's screen felt even smaller, the scene somehow more intimate. A car engine sounded faint in the distance. Maybe help coming, maybe just someone driving home late. Jonah held the phone steadier now, breath slower. Eli whispered another plea, softer this time. Just don't stop. I won't, Jonah said, and he meant it. Even if his hands ached from gripping the phone, even if his stomach knotted, he wouldn't look away. If no one else could give her safety yet, at least they could give her witness. Outside, the storm raged on, but something had shifted. More porches lit up. Someone's flashlight beam swept briefly across yards before cutting away. Quiet, unseen witnesses, faces behind curtains, cameras glowing blue in dark rooms, were gathering like an invisible crowd. The girl on the porch didn't know it yet, but she wasn't completely alone anymore. Rob shifted his weight, balancing the umbrella against the gust, and looked at the door with a frown that deepened the longer nothing happened. The rain had already soaked the back of his jacket and slid down his collar. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the child next to him, trembling and mute. He took one last breath, slow and steady, then stepped up the final inch of porch that separated them from the sealed house. His knuckles met the wood with a firm, deliberate rhythm. 3 measured knocks, not angry but clear enough to be heard over the storm. Karen, he called, voice carrying in a way that surprised even him. It's Rob. You need to open up. The sound hung in the wet air, swallowed partly by wind, partly by the steady roar of rain on shingles and gutters. He waited, straining to hear footsteps, voices, anything. The house answered only with its own creaks, faint and reluctant. He tried again, louder this time. Karen Doyle. She's freezing out here. Enough already. Open the door. The last 2 words came out sharper than he intended, pulled by a mix of worry and anger. Behind him, Mrs. Alvarez flinched slightly but didn't retreat. She had stepped up close enough now that the blanket she held brushed against Rob's elbow. Careful, she murmured, not as warning but as a plea for calm. I'm careful, Rob said without looking back. Then to the door. You hear me? The kid soaked. Inside there was a faint sound, so soft Rob wondered if he imagined it. A shift of weight on old wood, maybe, or the whisper of a curtain pulled aside. But it stopped quickly, replaced again by that intentional stillness, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. Lila shrank in on herself at the knocks, eyes flicking to the knob and back to her knees. The umbrella tilted farther toward her, giving her a wedge of space away from the downpour. Rob softened his voice, but kept it firm. Karen, come on. This isn't safe. She's a child. The last word cracked slightly, memory flashing of his own daughter at this age, so fragile once after a fever that wouldn't break. The door did not answer. Behind them, more witnesses edged closer. Not yet onto the Doyle property, but close enough that their presence could be felt. A neighbor with a baseball cap and flashlight angled the beam away to avoid blinding anyone, but kept it sweeping nearby. From the White House, Jonah's window light blinked once, as if his phone camera had refocused. Someone further down the block coughed loudly, a nervous sound carried on the wind. Mrs. Alvarez stepped up another inch, speaking low but clear. Karen? It's Marta from across the street. We're worried about Lila. She's freezing. Let's bring her inside. The rain filled the silence after her voice like applause no one wanted. Marta glanced sideways at Rob. He shook his head minutely. Nothing. Maybe she's not even in there, Marta whispered. She's there, Rob said quietly. Lights went on and off earlier. She's there. More knocking wouldn't change it. He sensed that now. Whoever was behind the door had decided on silence as armor, and yet the effort itself had done something. Every strike of his knuckles against the frame had rippled outward. Windows had brightened. Curtains moved. Phones in dark rooms had lit like small lanterns. Lila shifted again, slow and uncertain, glancing up at the man who kept calling for her mother. Her lips parted, but still no sound came out. He crouched a little to meet her eyes. "We're here," he said simply. "Okay? You're not alone." She blinked once and pressed her wet face back against her knees, but he thought maybe, just maybe, her shaking slowed. Marta moved closer, finally kneeling so the blanket hovered near but didn't touch. "Sweetheart, we're going to keep you warm soon," she promised softly, more to fill the air than to expect response. Another round of wind rattled the porch railing, making the umbrella bow again. Rob caught it before it flipped, muttering under his breath but keeping the cover steady. Somewhere down the block, a car engine approached. Not sirens yet, but headlights sweeping briefly across puddles before turning. More watchers appeared in doorways now, shapes half-sheltered, rain slickers pulled on over pajamas. The neighborhood that had started as scattered eyes behind glass was becoming something else, connected by quiet resolve. Rob looked once more at the door and knew it would probably stay closed, at least for now. The knocking had done what it could. Woken the street, broken the easy excuse of minding one's own business. He straightened slowly, old knees complaining, and stepped half a pace back to give the girl space. Marta dared move then, draping the blanket gently around Lila's shoulders. The child flinched, then froze, and finally let it stay. Marta's hands trembled, but she tucked the edges in softly until the shaking small body disappeared under warm fabric. Rob took a breath that felt like both failure and progress. The door hadn't opened, but the night itself had changed. More phones glowed. Another voice called from the curb, "Need help?" Someone asked cautiously. Rob answered without turning. "We're okay for now, but call it in if you haven't." Somewhere, dispatchers were already hearing the story from multiple directions. He could tell by the way heads were turning toward the street's far end, listening for sirens. He didn't knock again. There was no point in hammering at a barricade built out of pride or cruelty. Instead, he stayed where he was, a quiet shield between the girl and the door, while the rain drummed its endless rhythm and the street filled slowly with witness. What started with one phone and one question had turned into presence, and presence, real, standing, undeniable, was sometimes the loudest sound he could make. The storm had a way of swallowing sound, but inside her tidy living room 3 houses down, Claire Daniels could still hear the faint pattern of knocks that had just stopped. She had been standing at her own front window since the first message in the chat thread, the one from Marta Alvarez. At first, she told herself she was only curious, but then she caught sight of the soaked child under Rob Gibbons' umbrella, small and shivering, and all at once the years of training she carried from emergency wards settled over her like instinct. She turned from the window and found her phone on the counter. The group thread was alive. Rob's update, Marta's brief notes, neighbors firing questions and offers, but no one taking the next step. Claire's thumbs hesitated for only a second before she backed out of chat and pulled up the town's non-emergency line. She knew better than to call 911. This wasn't a car crash or a fire, but it was dangerous in its own quiet way. The phone rang longer than it should have before a clipped voice answered. Claire forced comm into her own, giving the dispatcher her name, her house number, the address of the Doyles. She said the words as plainly as she could. "There's a child locked outside in the rain. Appears frightened, possibly neglected. We need a welfare check." The dispatcher's questions came steady and practiced. Age of the child? Approximate? Claire guessed 9 or 10. Was the child injured? No visible injuries, but she's soaked and trembling, barefoot on one foot. Is the parent known to be home? Yes. Lights on and off earlier. Won't answer the door. Claire tried not to let frustration creep into her tone. She'd learned in ER that you get better help when you stay factual. The voice on the line said they would send an officer. Might take a bit because of weather and calls stacking up on the highway. An accident with multiple vehicles. Heavy rain slowing response. Claire pressed her lips together and said thank you anyway, though the knot in her stomach tightened. She asked them to log that a nurse was on scene and that a child's condition could worsen with exposure. The dispatcher acknowledged, promise to mark urgency, and rang off. Claire stood still for a moment, phone warm in her hand, listening to the house breathe around her. She felt the familiar helplessness of waiting, a sensation she hated. On shift she could act, order tests, hang fluids, bring warmth back to a body. Here she had no vitals to check, no warm blankets, but the one already slung over Marta's arm. She grabbed her own kit anyway. A waterproof jacket, another thick blanket from the linen closet, a small flashlight. Her husband, just coming out of the back room, started to ask what was happening, but one look at her face stopped him. "Stay here," she said softly. "I'll be right back." By the time she opened her front door, the storm had gained weight, rain driving at a slant, puddles deepening at the edges of the street. She kept the phone tucked in a zip pocket and lifted the flashlight beam just enough to see, not to startle. Halfway down her walkway, she could see the scene clearer. Rob standing like a damp statue with his umbrella angled wide. Marta crouched, tucking the blanket around the child. The girl's face was pale, except for the raw flush at her cheeks and nose. Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Not panic, but the clinical recognition of hypothermia beginning. The subtle shift from shivering to small, contained stillness. She quickened her pace and called ahead so they wouldn't jump. "It's Claire. I called it in," she said, voice raised over the wind but steady. Rob turned slightly, relief flickering across his tired face. Marta nodded quickly, her own hair dripping water into her eyes. "Thank God," Marta said. "They coming?" "Non-emergency says they're on their way," Claire replied, kneeling beside them and immediately setting her flashlight low to avoid blinding the girl. "Weather's bad, might slow them." She unzipped her jacket and draped it halfway across Lila's knees, working with gentle hands the way she would with any frightened patient. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly, eyes on the child's face but voice pitched to calm. "You're safe right now. We've got you." Lila didn't answer, but her gaze shifted, first to Claire's face, then to the new blanket being offered. When Claire touched her wrist briefly, checking warmth, the skin was cool and damp. She glanced at Rob and Marta, lowering her voice. "We need to keep her covered, out of the wind if we can." Rob nodded toward his house. "We can go there if," but the sentence died because of the door looming behind the child. No one wanted to cross the invisible legal line yet, not with the mother technically present. Claire read the room instantly. "Then we stay right here till law enforcement arrives," she said quietly, "but keep her wrapped." Behind them, more lights flared on. A neighbor from farther down the street came trudging through the rain with a thermos in one hand. Another leaned from a porch, shouting that an officer was 15 minutes out. The group chat must have turned into phone calls by now. The quiet watchers were done being quiet. Claire felt her pulse steady a little. Action always did that. She reached for her phone again, snapped a quick photo. Not for gossip, but documentation in case anyone later asked what condition the girl had been found in. She'd seen too many stories twisted by hearsay. She looked once more toward the street's far end, hoping for red and blue lights to cut through the rain. None yet, just headlights slipping past on the main road. But they would come. Until then, Maple Street stood half awake and vigilant. Adults drawn out of warm houses to hold a fragile line. The storm still fell in silver sheets, but something had shifted. No longer just weather, but witness, waiting. The rain slowed for a moment, not stopping but easing into a steadier rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as though the storm itself had paused to see what would happen next. In that brief lull, more doors opened. First, it was a man from the yellow house down the block, coming out with a golf umbrella big enough to cover a small car. Then the couple from number 12, still in pajamas under their coats, stepping carefully down their walk. Each arrival was quiet, hesitant, but it built momentum. Soon there were half a dozen umbrellas along the edge of the Doyle yard, forming an uneven arc of color and dripping fabric against the black night. No one moved past the sidewalk. It was an unspoken line, drawn by the idea that stepping onto another person's property, especially when that person hadn't asked you to, could turn help into trespass. Yet the line bent closer, with every hesitant shuffle. People came as far as they dared and then stopped, unsure what would be welcome or wise. Lila sat at the center of it all, wrapped now in Marta's blanket and partway under Rob's stubborn umbrella. She was so small that she almost disappeared in the folds of dark fabric, only her damp hair and pale face visible when the wind lifted the edge. She didn't look up, but every now and then her shoulders twitched with a quiet shiver. Claire Daniels knelt nearest, the flashlight balanced across her knee, beam angled low to keep the girl from feeling cornered. She was speaking in small, easy words about nothing. The weather, the way rain makes worms appear on sidewalks. Anything gentle to fill the air without demanding answers. Marta stayed beside her, hands on the blanket's edges like an anchor. Rob hovered, scanning both the house and the road, protective but restless. Behind them, the newcomers huddled closer together for warmth and courage. The man with the golf umbrella whispered to the pajama-clad couple, "Any word?" They shook their heads. Someone further back muttered, "Called the cops," and someone else said, 15 minutes, maybe." The group nodded quietly as if confirmation alone was progress. No one said the part everyone felt, that they were afraid of the door, afraid of what might come out if provoked, afraid of legal boundaries, of being accused of interference. Fear of making it worse warred with the instinct to act. So instead of breaking the invisible boundary, they built a living wall just outside it. Neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, their umbrellas dripping and swaying. Through the thin fabric of the blanket, Lila must have felt the shift. She lifted her head once, just enough for her eyes to scan the semicircle. Her expression flickered. Confusion, then something almost like wonder, then quick retreat back to knees and fabric. She hadn't expected so many grown-ups to appear. Claire saw it and caught the faintest breath of relief herself. "She sees us," she whispered to Marta. Marta's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away. The storm rumbled again, sending another cold sheet of rain across the group. A woman in a red parka broke from the back and jogged forward with a towel, stopping short of the porch, but tossing it gently toward Claire, who caught it without ceremony and tucked it around the girl's bare foot. The woman retreated just as quickly, heart pounding but face determined. The small act seemed to loosen something. A few others stepped closer to hand over thermoses, tissues, anything warm or dry they found on their way out. Phones glowed faintly all around, some filming, some just lighting messages as updates flew through the chat. Someone typed that help was officially on the way. Another said they'd flagged down a passing patrol car on the main road. Still, the waiting felt endless. Rob looked down at Lila, and then out across the cluster of neighbors. His voice, when it came, was quiet but meant for them all. "She's freezing," he said simply. "We just keep her safe until they get here." Heads nodded. A few murmured yes. No one turned back. Every few minutes, one or two would glance nervously toward the house, as if expecting Karen Doyle to appear, furious and shouting. The dark windows gave nothing back but their own warped reflections. That silence, heavy and deliberate, seemed to keep the circle from stepping onto the porch, though the desire was there. A car passed slowly at the far end of the street, headlights sweeping over the wet scene. The driver slowed, then moved on. The half-circle held firm, patient but tense, a protective edge where strangers turned to allies simply by showing up and not leaving. Claire kept checking the girl's skin with discreet brushes of her hand, making sure warmth hadn't bled too far away. Each time she found cold fingers or toes, she shifted the blankets, rubbed gently, murmured reassurances. "Almost done," she said once, more to herself than the child. "Help's close." Rob's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. A message from the thread, "Officer just a few streets over." He exhaled and caught Marta's eye, giving a tiny nod. Around them, neighbors read their own screens and passed the quiet news along. The half-circle straightened a little, like a crew that's been rowing for hours and finally sees shore. But still no one broke the line. The unspoken code held. They would not breach the threshold unless they had to. Instead, they became presence itself. Silent witnesses, a buffer of umbrellas and raincoats, standing in the weather to say without words that this child was not invisible. For Lila, tucked in her blanket, something changed. Her breathing slowed. The rigid hunch of her shoulders softened a fraction. She didn't speak, but she didn't curl tighter either. Surrounded by strangers who had decided she mattered enough to stand in the storm, she let herself lean, just slightly, into safety that hadn't been there minutes before. And on Maple Street, the night thick with rain, waiting became its own kind of rescue. Quiet, watchful, powerful in its refusal to walk away. Phones glowed in dozens of darkened rooms up and down Maple Street. Each small light a separate, private argument. The group thread had gone from cautious notes to a stream of blunt, jagged messages. Some typed with shaking fingers and a pounding heart. Others with the cool detachment of people sure they know where boundaries end. What had begun as Marta's soft anyone else seeing this had splintered into sides. From the Yellow House, someone posted, *careful, guys, not our business. * almost instantly, another bubble jumped beneath it. * she's a kid in the cold. That makes it our business. * a third came fast, hesitant. * you don't know the whole story. Could be discipline. * then, seconds later, no discipline leaves a child shivering like that. Claire Daniels read the stream while crouched by the girl, thumb flicking across the screen one-handed while her other kept the blanket secure. She didn't add her own thoughts. She didn't have free hands for debate, but her jaw clenched at each attempt to soften what they were all witnessing. Inside warm houses, people argue with themselves as much as with their neighbors. Mr. Lopez, 2 doors down from the Doyles, sat on the edge of his couch with his wife, both scrolling the same thread. "We don't know what happened," he murmured. "We should stay out of it." His wife shot him a look. "If that was our Sophia, would you want everyone to stay out?" He didn't answer. A minute later, she typed under his name, "Anyway, * this isn't right. Someone's got to stand there until help comes. *" Further along the block, a young man named Trevor, barely out of high school, tapped out, "Careful with cameras. You could get sued." Jonah saw it pop up and scowled at his phone, but didn't stop recording. He typed back before he could think, "Better sued than sorry." Then his mother's warning text came through again, telling him to stay out of adult business. And for a moment, guilt tugged at him. But one look at the drenched figure below erased it. The chat fractured and reformed, a storm inside the storm. Karen's always been tough on that kid, but this, someone wrote. Another responded sharply. Tough doesn't mean freezing your kid outside. Some tried to calm things. Police on the way, let's not escalate. But others shot back. Escalation? She's half hypothermic already. Claire's phone buzzed with a direct message from a co-worker who lived a few streets over, but was watching the feed. Wanted to drive over? Claire typed quickly. No need. We got eyes on her, but thanks. Just keep calling dispatch to push them. In Marta's kitchen, her teenage son Raphael watched her husband read aloud from the thread and shake his head. "We don't know what set it off," the man said. "Could have been bad." Marta turned from the window with rain plastered to her hairline and said flatly, "Doesn't matter. She's a child." Then she went back out the door before he could stop her, her boots splashing onto the sidewalk where the waiting circle had formed. Fear of legal backlash wrestled with a deeper instinct to protect. Many had grown up with strict warnings about interfering in other families' discipline. But each time someone typed "not our place," another neighbor countered with a quiet fury. It becomes our place when the kid could die of cold. Jonah's hands cramped from holding the phone, but he didn't lower it. Eli whispered, "People are fighting about it." Jonah nodded, eyes locked on the scene. Let them. They're still watching. Somewhere at the far end of the street, a garage door rumbled. Out stepped an older man in a rain slicker, cane in one hand, phone in the other. He didn't bother with a chat. He just came, slow and steady, to join the arc. His umbrella made the circle a little wider, the child's shelter a little stronger. In houses where curtains hadn't moved all night, people scrolled and scrolled, fighting small private wars with their own fear. A young mother typed, "Someone tell me what's happening. I can't go out with the baby, but I'm watching." Another responded, "Just watch for sirens. They're close." The arguments weren't tidy. They weren't all noble either. Some were defensive. This could blow back on us. Others cynical. People always overreact. But under it all was the undeniable fact that no one had gone fully back to their television shows or dinners. The The thread kept moving, alive, angry, protective in its messy way. Outside, the human shape of that digital argument was visible. Neighbors inching closer, umbrellas touching now, an unbroken semicircle between the girl and the street. Fear of overstepping hadn't disappeared, but decency had taken up space anyway. Claire felt her phone buzz with one last ping before she tucked it away. Asterisk, we see you. Stay safe. Asterisk, she looked up at the row of watchers, and then back at Lila, who sat rapt but still silent, small fingers clutching the blanket edge. More than one set of eyes was on her now, not hidden behind curtains but present, insisting in the quietest way possible that her suffering would not be ignored. On Maple Street, loyalty to privacy and custom cracked under the weight of what was plainly happening. It didn't end the arguing. The thread was still alive and fierce. But out in the rain, action was winning ground inch by inch, each hesitant neighbor deciding that sometimes their business is exactly what you see before you. Time thinned into something strange and heavy. The storm no longer felt like a passing weather pattern, but a presence pressing down on every shoulder. Rain came steady and punishing, filling gutters until they overflowed and splashed cold against ankles. The air smelled of wet pavement and leaf pulp, a scent that always meant late autumn and endings. People shifted their weight, boots sinking into soft ground, coats darkened to nearly black with water. A few had tried to wait just long enough to say they'd been there, then slipped back to their houses when the chill proved sharper than expected. From porches came the soft squeak of doors closing. Lights glowed behind curtains as silhouettes retreated, yet the shape of the circle remained. It thinned, but it did not vanish. Rob stayed planted like a fence post, umbrella bowed and leaking at one edge but still protecting the small huddled figure. Marta crouched nearby, one hand resting light on the blanket at the girl's back, a silent promise not to leave. Claire, steady and professional even as water dripped from her hood, kept two fingers occasionally at the girl's wrist, checking warmth without making it obvious. Across the street, Jonah and Eli hadn't moved from their window, though their mother had tried twice to get them away. Jonah's phone battery flashed low, but he ignored it. Eli whispered periodic updates no one asked for, his breath fogging the glass. Rob's still there. Marta's still there. Claire's talking to her again. It was a child's way of keeping fear at bay, turning the scene into something orderly and named. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled again, long and low, promising more rain. The sound bounced between the houses and seemed to pull everyone's eyes down the street toward the main road where help might appear. But nothing came, just a hiss of water on asphalt and the occasional car passing at normal speed, headlights sweeping by and gone. The chat on everyone's phones flickered between hope and worry. Dispatch said units coming. Weather's bad, maybe delayed. Someone call again? Already did. Even as some gave up and dried their hair in warm kitchens, they kept typing. Distance felt safer than standing in the storm, but guilt kept them tethered to thread. Claire tried to keep her voice gentle for the girl. Almost there, sweetheart. We'll get you warm soon. Lila didn't answer, but she was still awake. Small movements under the blanket betraying life and listening. The shivering had quieted, not gone, but less violent. Claire worried whether that was improvement or the first numbness of too much cold, but she forced calm into her face. Marta glanced back once and saw fewer figures than before, but the core remained. Rob a silent wall, Claire a steady hum of care, a few others just behind, ready if something turned dangerous. That was enough, she told herself. Enough to hold the line until red lights cut the rain. Rob's phone buzzed. He looked and saw only another variation of their coming. He tucked it back into his soaked jacket. He hated waiting. Waiting meant you could do nothing but keep the umbrella steady and hope strangers with authority arrived before harm deepened. The girl moved then, small but clear. She leaned the tiniest bit toward Marta's side, letting the blanket settle more fully around her. Marta's breath caught. She didn't move except to angle the fabric tighter and murmur, "You're safe, baby." For a flicker of time, the world shrank to this small triangle of people under rain. Man, nurse, neighbor, and a child learning maybe, just maybe, to trust. Around them, the circle of others stood like sentries, watching both house and road. The Doyle window stayed black. No sound, no apology, no sudden unlocking of the door. It was a defiance, so solid it might have been brick. But for all its weight, the house no longer felt all-powerful. Its thread shrunk against the quiet determination standing in the yard. Jonah whispered to Eli, "It's like a force field." Eli nodded, eyes wide. A people force field. Minutes dragged long enough that the cold became its own danger. Claire glanced at Rob. He understood without words and shifted to block more wind. Marta shifted closer too. Nobody said aloud, but they were ready to take the child and leave if help stayed lost too long. Then a sound, not siren, but distant, teased the edge of hearing. Everyone froze for half a breath. But it was only another car on the main road, tires slicing through puddles, then gone. A few neighbors would come outside audibly. Someone swore under their breath. The storm filled the gap with another rush of water from a gutter. Claire leaned forward and whispered to the girl, "You're brave. You're so brave." She felt the tiniest nod under the blanket. That was enough to keep waiting a little longer. The chat buzzed again. Asterisk unit was diverted. Another call. Try to get second one out. Asterisk Marta swore softly in Spanish, then smoothed the blanket to keep the girl from hearing her anger. Rain gathered at the porch edge and spilled over in thin ropes. Rob's shoulders were hunched with cold, but he didn't step back. Not until lights came, real ones, flashing red and white. But that hadn't happened yet. They stood, and the rain came down and the long night stretched, each minute an act of stubborn presence. Even those who retreated to warm hadn't gone far. Their screens kept them tethered, and the few still outside carried the weight for all. The girl was not alone, not invisible, not abandoned to the storm's appetite. Waiting had turned into something fierce and real, an answer to the silence behind the door. Marta Alvarez had stood at the edge of the porch long enough to feel the cold soak through the seams of her boots. Her cardigan was heavy with water. Her hood kept sliding off and clinging to her neck. She kept glancing toward the silent windows, half expecting them to flare with light and a furious figure to appear. But nothing changed. The storm poured down. The girl sat motionless under the fraying blanket, and minutes stretched until they felt cruel. Something in Marta, mother, neighbor, woman long past caring about polite boundaries, snapped quiet and sure. She moved before she fully decided to. One step, then another, until she was standing beside Rob at the top of the steps. He glanced sideways, eyebrows lifted in a quick question, but she didn't slow. She shrugged her soaked coat off her shoulders and held it for a moment, debating. Then, without asking, she reached toward the small bundle of blanket and fear that was Lila. The girl flinched so hard Marta's heart almost broke, but she didn't stop. She kept her movement slow, palms open, eyes soft. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, voice low and certain, the way she used to talk to her own children after nightmares. "You're safe." She draped the coat around the girl, layering it over the damp blanket until there was at least one barrier against the biting wind. Up close, Marta could see how bad it was. Skin pale under streetlight, lips faintly bluish, hair heavy and tangled. The one bare foot trembled where it poked out. She wanted to scoop the child up right then and march her across the street, but she held back because of the waiting, the legality, the fear of making things worse before help arrived. Instead, she just rapped and whispered. Lila's breath hitched at the sound of her voice. She didn't look up at first, but her body tipped almost imperceptibly toward the warmth being offered. Marta felt it, a tiny surrender, fragile and brave. "That's right," she murmured, tucking the coat tighter. "We've got you." Rob exhaled beside her, a sound part relief, part frustration. "Still nothing?" he asked, his eyes flicking to the door again. Marta shook her head. The house remained a dark, unyielding wall. No footsteps, no crack of light, no parent voice to reclaim what they'd left. The door seemed heavier now, not just with intention. Behind them the circle held, shifting closer by inches. Someone whispered encouragement. Another called softly that police were near. Flashlights dipped and bobbed, their glow bouncing across rain-wet grass and pooling at Marta's feet. The neighborhood had grown bolder watching her move. She had done what many wanted to do but feared. From a far edge of the yard, a man in the red parka stepped forward, calling over the sound of rain. "Need another blanket?" Claire glanced back and nodded quickly. He tossed it to her. the heavy roll arcing to the wet air and landing with a slap. She knelt and helped Marta layer it on. Together they worked as if they'd always known how. Strangers turned into a team by a child's need. Jonah, high in his window, kept filming, but now with a steadier hand. His earlier trembling had given way to something focused. Eli whispered, awed. She went up there. Jonah nodded, quiet pride mixing with worry. Marta shifted back just enough to meet Lila's eyes. They were dark and swimming, but clearer now, not the empty stare from before. "We're here," she said again, making sure the girl saw her mouth form the words. "We're not leaving." A gust rattled the house, the loose gutter clanging against siding. Instinctively, Marta and Rob both turned toward the door, shoulders bracing as if it might finally swing open. But nothing, just wind and the sound of water spilling from roof to porch. Claire muttered, mostly to herself, "If this goes another 10 minutes, we take her, mother or no mother." Rob didn't argue. His silence was agreement. Marta's jaw tightened. None of them wanted confrontation, but the child's cold seeped through all their caution. Phones buzzed around the circle with updates. Siren closed now, just off Maple. Someone texted. 2 blocks away. Hope rippled outward in visible relief. People straightened. A few whispered, "Thank God." But Marta didn't loosen her grip. For the first time since she'd stepped out of her house, Marta looked at the door and spoke not to Karen, but to whatever part of herself had doubted. "Enough," she said quietly, almost under her breath. "This child isn't alone anymore." Lila's head tipped a fraction against Marta's shoulder. So slight it might have been accident, but Marta felt it and nearly wept with the weight of it. She reached up and smoothed wet hair back from the girl's face. Just once, careful not to push. The girl didn't flinch this time. Behind them, headlights turned onto Maple Street, still far but cutting bright tunnels through rain. Red light flashed faint and quick on wet pavement. A murmur ran through the small crowd. Someone whispered, "Here they come." But Marta kept her eyes on Lila. She hadn't done much, just stepped past fear and put her coat where it belonged. But it felt like the first true break of the night. Not the door, not yet, but something larger had opened. A way through isolation, a moment of belonging in the middle of cold and neglect. The house stayed silent, but now its silence felt small compared to the living warmth building around one child on a rain-soaked porch. It happened so quietly at first that Marta almost thought she imagined it, a subtle shift of weight behind the wood, the squeak of an unseen hinge straining. Rob's head snapped toward the sound before anyone else caught it. Even Lila stiffened under the layers of coat and blanket, her small shoulders tightening like a bird about to bolt. The whole circle seemed to inhale at once, rain tapping steady on umbrellas and jackets as every gaze fixed on the door. Then the knob turned with a reluctant click. A thin line of warm light cut through the dark and spilled across the wet porch floor, weak but startling after so long staring at black. Marta's hands went still where they held the coat. Claire's breath caught. Even those at the sidewalk leaned unconsciously forward, though no one dared move closer. The door opened only a crack, no more than an inch or two, just enough for a wedge of light and a sliver of face. Karen Doyle's eyes flashed through. Quick, hard, the eyes of someone cornered. Her hair looked damp, stuck to her cheek, and a single chain from the safety lock glimmered before it rattled taut. She didn't step out. She stayed half in shadow. Her voice came sharp and brittle, cutting through the storm. "She needs to learn." The words hung for a beat too long, jagged and ugly against the night. Marta felt them hit her like cold water. Rob's jaw worked. His fingers flexed once against the umbrella handle. Claire rose slowly from her crouch, but said nothing yet, eyes fixed on the gap. Before anyone could speak, before the neighbors could even find their outrage, the door slammed hard enough to make the porch railing tremble. The narrow light vanished. Only the echo remained, bouncing down Maple Street until it was eaten by rain and thunder. For a moment, there was just stunned silence. The storm still hissed and drummed, but everything human went very still. Even Lila seemed to fold inward, pulling the coat closer like a shield. Marta swallowed down the raw urge to shout something back, some plea or accusation, but she forced herself to stay calm for the girl. Claire was the first to find her voice. It came quiet but steel-edged. "That's not parenting," she said, almost under her breath, but loud enough for those nearest to hear. Rob exhaled through his nose, a sound like steam escaping. "No," he agreed, steady but shaking with restrained anger. "That's cruelty." Around them the waiting circle tightened, umbrellas angling closer, as if the group were a living thing drawing together to protect its center. People muttered, some in disbelief, some in quiet fury. Someone whispered, "Did she just?" Another voice cut in, "Yeah, she did." Phones lit again. A dozen fingers typed at once. She opened the door, told us she needs to learn, slammed it shut. Documented. "Police 2 streets away. Get here now." The chat that had been splintered with hesitation now burned with unified resolve. Claire crouched back to Lila's level, though her face was tight with emotion. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "that's not about you being bad. That's not okay." Lila's chin trembled, but she didn't cry. She just stared at the wet floorboards, breathing fast and shallow. Marta smoothed her coat back around her gently and whispered something soothing in Spanish. Words meant less to be understood, and more to pour warmth where cold words had landed. Rob took one careful step closer to the door and stopped, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough not to escalate. He didn't raise his voice. "Karen," he said, measuring low, "the police are on the way." "She's freezing. This isn't safe. Please don't make this worse." He waited, but the house stayed mute, the single cracked light from earlier swallowed again by dark. Marta felt the fear ripple through the circle. Fear not a house, but what defiance might mean once authority arrived. Yet under that fear there was also something new. Clarity. The slammed door had stripped away any lingering doubt about what was happening. No one could call this discipline anymore. It was cruelty, named and witnessed. Claire pulled out her phone again and quietly spoke to dispatch. "She opened the door and refused care," she reported, voice steady but with an edge now. "Child is cold, wet, still outside. We have blankets and shelter, but need immediate response." She gave her credentials this time, registered nurse, and heard the tone on the other end change. She nodded sharply at whatever was said and hung up. "They're coming faster now," she told the others. Rain surged again, a fresh curtain sweeping across the yard. People hunched but held their ground. Jonah and Eli kept filming from above. Even through the glass, Jonah's face looked older than it had an hour ago. He zoomed on the door, on the coats and blankets, on the living proof that no one imagined this. Lila shifted slightly, almost imperceptible, and Marta realized the girl was listening, hearing the adults stand firm. Marta bent closer and whispered, "You're not alone, mi cielo. We're here." The child's damp lashes flickered once in response, and though no words came, the trembling seemed to slow. Another neighbor, the man with the red parka, stepped forward enough to plant his umbrella wider, making the shelter larger. "She's not getting taken back inside like that," he muttered to Rob, who nodded once, still watching the door. Minutes crept, thick and hard, but something fundamental had shifted. The mother's voice had come and gone like a match struck in darkness, brief, searing, then gone, but it had lit the truth for everyone outside. They weren't imagining, weren't overreacting. They were witnessing harm, and they were not turning away. Far down Maple, a low hum finally rose, the unmistakable thrum of an approaching engine, different from random traffic. Heads turned, alert. The storm tried to drown it out, but hope sharpened every ear. Marta held Lila closer and whispered once more, "Almost over, sweetheart, almost." And for the first time that night, the child didn't flinch at the words. The glow of phones multiplied like lanterns being lit one by one. What began with Jonah's shaky feed from the attic window rippled outward until half the circle had their devices raised or tucked discreetly at chest height, screens glimmering through the wet dark. No one shouted or pushed forward. The mood was too raw for noise. Instead, there was a hum of digital witness. Quiet, deliberate, undeniable. Jonah's clip hit the group chat first. It was rough and grainy, rain streaking across the lens, but the important things were clear. The small soaked figure on the porch, the coats being wrapped around her, and most of all the brief sliver of light when the door cracked. Karen's voice harsh and thin. Came through the mic just enough to be unmistakable. She needs to learn. Then the slam, loud and final. You could hear someone gasp off camera. You could hear rain. Within seconds, replies exploded under the clip. Asterisk, we heard that. Save it. Asterisk, get a copy before it disappears. Evidence if she tries to twist this later. Others wrote more softly. Poor baby. Keep her warm. Some messages read like prayers typed in haste. Across the street, Trevor, the same one who'd warned about lawsuits, recorded anyway now. His lens swept the porch carefully, pausing on Marta's bent back, Claire's steady hands, Rob's wide umbrella. He didn't post right away, but he saved it, eyes hard. Something about the slammed door had snapped the hold of fear. Legal worry shrank next to the cold clarity of harm. People still standing in the rain stayed mostly silent. There was a shared understanding that shouting might make everything worse for the child. But silence didn't mean apathy. It meant control. Underneath, anger burned hot and bright. You could feel it in the stillness, in the way umbrellas didn't waver now, in the steady stare aimed at the house. When headlights passed at the end of the street, more than one person raised a phone reflexively, ready to record any new movement. Marta noticed a shift even as she kept her hands firm around the child. It wasn't chaos. It was coordination born of instinct, digital and physical presence merging into one shield. She leaned to Claire and whispered, "She's not going to get away with saying it's nothing." Claire's eye stayed on Lila, but she nodded once, a clipped, sure movement. Jonah's video, shared again by others, found its way to neighbors who hadn't even known what was happening. Doorbells rang quietly along Maple and adjacent streets. New people joined the thread and asked if help was still needed. Some said they were driving over, storm or not. Others offered to call dispatch too, stack pressure on the system to hurry. Inside houses where fear had kept people frozen, screens were now showing the undeniable. The slammed door, the words, "She needs to learn," hit differently when you saw a soaked child curl tighter under them. For some who typed, "Not our business," earlier, shame and resolve tangled until their next message read only, "Asterisk, I was wrong. Stay safe. I'm here if needed." Asterisk. Rob kept his phone tucked away, but others around him recorded openly now, light from their screens flashing on wet faces. One woman even braced her phone on the top of her umbrella to steady the shot. The quiet fury wasn't about spectacle. It was about record. Proof no one could erase or rewrite later. They had learned from news stories that evidence mattered. Claire, noticing, didn't stop them. She only whispered, "No faces of the kid," and the woman with the umbrella nodded, angling her camera down so Lila's profile stayed shielded. Protect the child first. That was rule one. The neighborhood chat changed tone as more footage rolled in. Gone were the frantic should we debates. Now it was updates and coordination. Police close. Stay back, but keep watch. Asterisk, blankets okay? Warm packs. Asterisk, someone offered their garage if they needed shelter. Another said, "I'm a lawyer if this gets ugly." Even digital space was becoming a safety net. Marta could feel it radiating back across the wet street. Support, outrage, care. She kept whispering small nothings to Lila, about tea waiting, about dry socks, just sounds to counter the echo of that slammed door. The child didn't speak, but her breathing, ragged before, had steadied into something more even. Every now and then a flashlight swept across the road, catching the reflective tape on coats and hoods. It wasn't frantic searchlight. It was quiet patrol, neighbors watching angles, making sure no one slipped past unnoticed. The digital thread hummed with instructions that no one had said aloud. Asterisk, keep it safe. Stay calm. Don't provoke. Asterisk. Rob leaned slightly toward Marta, voice low. "This is what keeps her safe till they get here," he said, nodding at the circle in the phones beyond. Marta just nodded, throat too tight to answer. Upstairs, Jonah's battery died. He cursed softly, but Eli shoved his own phone into his brother's hand without hesitation. "Keep going," Eli said. Jonah looked at him, saw tears glinting, but took the phone and resumed filming. Then, faint but clear, came another sound under the rain, a single electronic chirp. Dispatch radio somewhere near. Heads turned in unison. The chat lit up, lights coming. Someone at the far end typed. Unit turned on to Maple. Nobody cheered. The fury was too quiet, too focused for celebration. But shoulders lifted slightly, breaths released. Marta pulled Lila closer, murmuring that help was nearly here. Claire reached once more to check the girl's pulse. Found it steady enough. Phones didn't lower. If anything, they angled toward the street, ready to document the next step. The waiting had changed into something measured and fierce. Not just neighbors hoping, but neighbors watching, archiving, promising by their presence that this night wouldn't vanish into rumor or excuse. Digital and real fused into a single quiet force. We saw, we stayed, we will not let this disappear. Claire Danielle's knees sank into the soaked porch without hesitation. The nurse in her had stopped caring about the water creeping up her pant legs or the ache that would follow. Her focus narrowed to the child curled tight under coats and blankets. She tugged at the edges gently until small hands appeared, limp and trembling. One glance at the fingertips was enough to make her chest tighten. Pale at first glance, but edged in dusky blue, nails faintly violet under the porch light's weak glow. She cradled them with practiced care, rubbing warmth back in without friction that might hurt. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, leaning closer so the girl didn't have to meet her eyes. "I'm just warming your hands, okay? Just me." The child didn't pull away this time, only twitched once as icy water dripped from her sleeves. Claire used her own body heat, cupping those small fists between her palms, and silently cursed how long help was taking. Behind her, Rob Given shifted his umbrella to cover them both. The movement was subtle but deliberate, a slow tilt that cut the wind's reach and funneled the worst of the rain off to the side. Water cascaded over the edge in a silver rope, landing beyond Claire's boots. He didn't say anything. His expression was a grim sort of determination, jaw set, eyes always flicking between the child and the still house behind them. Each gust that rattled the doorframe made his grip tighten on the umbrella handle. Around them, the circle of neighbors adjusted in quiet choreography. No one spoke above a murmur now, but their silence was alive, protective. Flashlights lowered to keep from glaring into Lila's face. Voices in the chat slowed as people realized the girl could hear even faint tones of alarm. It was as if the entire street had taken a collective breath and agreed to form a wall, not of noise, but of presence. Claire looked over her shoulder long enough to meet Marta's eyes. The older woman gave a tiny nod and shifted closer, tucking more fabric across Lila's knees. Marta's lips moved and whispered Spanish again, gentle things, almost like lullabies. The girl didn't answer but didn't recoil either, and that small permission felt monumental. Rob bent slightly toward Claire without lowering his voice enough to exclude Lila, but soft enough to keep it calm. "Color's bad?" he asked. Claire shook her head faintly, but didn't sugarcoat it. "Too cold. We need her out of this weather soon." Then, more softly, leaning toward the girl, "We'll get you warm, honey. Almost there." From the sidewalk, the man in the red parka stepped forward again and offered a pair of thick gloves, probably grabbed in a rush from his garage. He didn't step onto the porch, still respecting the invisible boundary, but he extended them far enough that Marta could lean out and take them. "Here," he said quietly. Claire nodded gratitude, slid them onto Lila's small hands over the rub of warmth she'd been giving. They dwarfed her fingers but added another layer between child and cold. Thunder rolled far off, dull and tired now rather than sharp. Rain still came, but lighter, more insistent than punishing. The neighborhood seemed to have settled into a strange, tense calm. Action enough to keep the girl alive and safe, but quiet to avoid provoking the unseen mother behind the door. Claire leaned in close again, lowering her voice so only Lila might hear. "You're doing so well. So brave." She felt the child's hands twitch, then slowly curl inside the gloves, a tiny act of self-preservation. Relief burned behind her ribs. Rob adjusted the umbrella once more, water dripping onto his back, but leaving Claire and Lila dry. His shoulders were hunched against the cold, but he looked like he could hold the thing up all night if it came to it. Marta noticed and slipped one in her own sodden coat against his arm, sharing what little warmth she could. The protective silence grew heavier, thicker. Even phones seemed to dim, a few still recorded but screens angled down. Conversation retreated to whispers at the edges. Updates about sirens, coordination with dispatch, but nothing loud enough to startle the child. Maple Street, often noisy with late-night television and teenage laughter, had gone reverent. Claire caught sight of headlights turning slowly at the far end, but didn't react yet, not wanting to give false hope if they weren't meant for this house. Instead, she kept rubbing the girl's hands lightly, counting heartbeats with a feel of small wrists. She thought about her own daughter asleep a few blocks away, dry and warm, and her throat tightened. Marta shifted forward and brushed damp strands of hair from Lila's face. "Casi terminado," she murmured, almost finished. "Queda poquito." The child's breathing hitched but steadied again, as if the words tethered her. Rob glanced at the door, then back at the girl. He was ready to break the last bit of distance, if needed, ready to take whatever came if the house erupted again. But for now, he just stood guard. The storm had brought them here. Strangers made allies by rain and a child's need, and now their stillness held more weight than noise ever could. The waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was a shield built from coats, hands, and wordless resolve. Somewhere down the street, the hum of an engine grew clearer, but no one spoke. They stayed as they were. Nurse kneeling, men sheltering, woman whispering, a half-circle of soaked witnesses holding a fragile life steady against the cold and the dark until help arrived. The sound came first, low and distinct under the patter of rain, the slow hum of a motor easing down the street. Heads turned almost in unison, umbrellas shifting as every soaked neighbor strained to see through the dark. Then light broke the night. Headlamps swept across the wet pavement, glinting off puddles, scattering silver across boots and porches. A new hush rippled outward, charged and expectant. The cruiser rolled to a careful stop just short of the Doyle house. Tires hissed against the curbside water. The glow of tail lights painted the rain red. For a moment, no one moved. Even the storm seemed to draw back slightly, its roar softening to a steady drumbeat. Through the windshield, silhouettes. 2 officers sat motionless for a breath, taking in the scene before stepping into it. When the doors finally opened, it was deliberate and unhurried. First a driver, tall, rain slicker already half zipped over his uniform, boots splashing into the gutter as he stepped out. Then the passenger, shorter, younger, scanning with quick, bright eyes but holding himself calm. They spoke briefly, their voices low enough not to carry, then split, one heading up the walk, the other staying back to speak with neighbors at the edge. Claire looked up from where she still knelt beside Lila and met the first officer's eyes. He moved slowly, hands open, posture non-threatening. "Evening," he said softly, though his voice carried enough to be heard over rain. "We're here now." Rob straightened but didn't step away, his umbrella still fixed over Claire and the girl. "She's freezing," he said, steady but edge of the hours of tension behind it. "Been locked out in the rain." Mother cracked the door, said she needs to learn, then slammed it. The officer's face hardened almost imperceptibly, but he kept his voice level. "Thank you. Who's been with her?" Claire raised her hand briefly, still rubbing small glove fingers. "I'm a nurse," she said. "She's cold but responsive. Needs warmth soon." He nodded once, eyes scanning the child quickly and professionally, then looked back toward the cruiser and signaled with 2 fingers. The younger officer came forward with a heavy blanket from the trunk, thick police-issue thermal, and crouched to hand it off. Claire accepted and began tucking it gently around Lila while murmuring, "You're safe now, honey. Help's here." Behind them, the gathered neighbors shifted but didn't scatter. Some lowered phones, some kept them steady but aimed low. The quiet wasn't distrust. It was protective watchfulness. The street had been holding this line all night and wasn't ready to dissolve just because lights had arrived. The younger officer glanced back toward the house. "Mom inside?" he asked quietly. She was. Rob answered, opened the door long enough to yell, then shut it again. The officer nodded, jaw tight. He tapped his radio mic. Speaking code Claire couldn't catch, then looked up at the dark windows. "We'll make contact." He moved slowly toward the porch door, but stopped a few feet back, staying aware of the child and the neighbors. His partner joined him, the 2 speaking briefly before the younger one tried a gentle knock. Just 3 quiet raps, far different from Rob's earlier pounding. "Miss Doyle? This is the police," he said, voice firm but controlled. "We need to talk to you about your daughter." Silence answered. Rain pattered against the cruiser roof. Water dripped steadily from the eaves. The older officer tried again, louder but not hostile. "Karen Doyle, this is law enforcement. We need you to open the door." Still nothing. The younger officer looked back to Claire, who gave a small shake of her head. No sound from inside since that one slam. He tried once more, the knock sharper now. "Karen, for your child's safety, open the door." No response. The officers exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. One turned back and addressed Rob and Marta. "We'll handle contact. You can step back if you want." Rob hesitated, eyes on the girl. Marta's voice came soft but firm. "We're staying with her." The older officer gave a single nod, something in his expression almost grateful. "That's fine." Behind them, neighbors remained still, their umbrellas and raincoats part of the night now, bearing witness. Phones flickered again, not with panic, but with quiet recording. This wasn't a challenge to police, but a hold on to truth, to make sure the long, hard night stayed honest. Claire felt her shoulders finally loosen just a fraction. The blanket's warmth was already creeping back into the girl's small body. She checked the pulse again, better now, stronger. "You're safe," she whispered once more, and this time Lila's eyes flickered open, dark and dazed, but aware enough to meet hers for a heartbeat before slipping closed again. The younger officer bent slightly to Claire's level. "We'll get a medic to check her, just in case," he said. Claire nodded thanks, though her hands stayed where they were. She wasn't letting go until the child was truly out of danger. The patrol car's headlights cast long silver beams down Maple, glinting off puddles and umbrellas. For the first time that night, hope wasn't just whispered. It felt solid in the air. Not triumph, not relief, but the first true shift from desperate waiting to tangible help. Still, the house stayed dark, but now its power seemed to shrink under the combined force of community and law. The rain hadn't stopped, but it no longer felt as heavy. People straightened their backs, breaths sinking with the quiet, watchful work of the officers. Claire brushed one wet strand of hair from Lila's forehead and thought, "She isn't alone anymore. Whatever comes next, the night has been seen." And the seeing, after all those long soaked hours, was already its own kind of rescue. The officers didn't move fast. They had stepped into a fragile space, one built of fear, protection, and a child's quiet suffering, and they seemed to know it. The younger one stayed with Claire and Marta a moment longer, eyes checking the blanket-wrapped figure, without leaning too close. Then he straightened and turned to face the cluster of neighbors under their dripping umbrellas. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked, not barked. No clip command, no assumption control, just a request that landed gently but firmly. "We want to understand what happened here." Rob gave the smallest nod first. That broke whatever spell had kept people rooted. A handful stepped closer from the edge of the yard, careful not to crowd the porch. Those still watching from doorways leaned out a little more. Nobody rushed forward. This wasn't about drama anymore. It was about telling the truth. The older officer pulled a small notepad from his jacket, paper already spotted with rain, and spoke with a kind of measured calm meant to keep frightened communities steady. "We need to know what you saw, what you heard, so we can make sure this child is safe tonight and after tonight. One at a time, please." It was Marta who spoke first. Her voice trembled at the start, but found strength as she went on. She described looking out her window, seeing the girl soaked and barefoot, knocking again and again with no answer. She spoke about messages flying in the chat, about stepping across her yard when she couldn't bear it anymore. "She was shaking," Marta said, tears cutting new wet paths down her already damp cheeks. "Like my own babies used to when they were scared. And the door had stayed closed." Rob's turn followed, short but steady. He told of the first knocks, of calling Karen's name, of the one flash of light in that voice, harsh and deliberate, saying the child needed to learn. His jaw tightened at the memory, but his recounting stayed clear and factual. Then it slammed. Hard. We kept her warm as best we could. Claire added clinical details, her nurse's precision giving weight to the story. Extremities cold, lips pale, early hypothermia. She was responsive but shutting down. I called dispatch twice when response delayed. The mother made no attempt to retrieve or shelter her. The man in the red parka added his part. The gloves, the long waiting. Others offered timestamps for messages, small confirmatory details. Even those who hadn't stepped off their porches raised voices to call across the wet street. We saw the same. She was out there long before anyone came. It was rough testimony, but consistent. The kind that builds a spine of truth. Through it all, Jonah stayed half hidden behind his brother until the older officer looked up and asked quietly, "I'm told there's video." Jonah startled like a deer, almost dropped the phone he'd been clutching. Eli's hand shot out to steady it. Jonah's throat bobbed hard, but he nodded. Yeah. I recorded. The door, her voice, everything. His voice cracked. Still young, but carrying something older now. The younger officer softened immediately, holding out a palm without stepping forward. "Would you mind sharing? It helps keep her safe." Jonah looked at his brother, then down at the phone. His fingers were trembling so badly he fumbled with the screen before he could open a file. Eli leaned in, whispering something. Probably just, "You got it." Jonah swallowed and finally managed to hit play. The clip filled the damp air for a moment, tiny but searing. The rain, the small bundled figure, the creak of the door, Karen's voice. She needs to learn. Sharp enough to cut even on replay. When the slam came, everyone flinched again. The officers listened without interruption. The older one took notes. The younger one's jaw flexed once, but his face stayed controlled. When it ended, Jonah thrust the phone forward awkwardly. "I can send it," he said, voice too loud in his own ears. "I save a copy too." The younger officer took the phone carefully, asked Jonah's full name and number, and helped him airdrop the file to their department device. "You did the right thing," he said quietly, returning the phone with a steady look. Jonah's ears flushed. He ducked his head and handed the device back to Eli like it weighed more than it should. Rob clapped the boy lightly on the shoulder as he passed to rejoin the group. "Good job, kid," he murmured, and Jonah blinked fast but didn't answer. The questioning moved slowly, patient and methodical. No one was treated like a suspect. It felt instead like piecing together a shared truth. Each account stacked on the last until the picture was whole and undeniable. A child locked out in cold rain for punishment that crossed into danger. A mother silent behind her door, while an entire street stood guard. Through it all, Lila didn't move much, but she seemed aware. Her eyes cracked open once when Jonah's video played, then fluttered shut again, but her breathing stayed even. Claire kept one hand at her shoulder, protective but not confining. When the officers finally paused, the older one looked at the soaked group with something like respect. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your willingness to step and probably save her from harm tonight. We'll take it from here." The circle didn't break. It only shifted to let the police pass. But in their faces was relief, exhaustion, and a quiet, shared resolve. They had spoken, and the truth was now recorded in more than whispers and rain. The door opened again, this time not in stealth, but with a sudden clatter that startled even the officers. It swung halfway, chain removed, and there she was, Karen Doyle, framed in the harsh light spilling from her hallway. She looked smaller than the house that had kept her hidden, but her stance was sharp as a blade, arms crossed tight, jaw set hard enough to look painful. She scanned the yard with a gaze meant to cut through strangers and send them scattering. But no one scattered. Rain slicked across the porch boards and drummed steady on umbrellas. The small group that had guarded the child all night did not retreat. They simply straightened, a silent wall between Karen and the girls still swaddled in coats. Marta stayed half-crouched at Lila's side, one hand protective on the bundle of blankets. Rob stood just behind, umbrella high, his face unreadable but unflinching. Claire stayed kneeling, head slightly turned toward Karen, but her hands still busy keeping the child warm. Karen's eyes flickered when she saw how many there were. Not just Marta and Rob anymore, a full crescent of raincoats and determined faces, all watching, some with phones still up, screens pale against the dark. The sight hit like cold air, but she hid the flinch behind a sneer. "What the hell are you all doing on my property?" Her voice cracked on the edges of fury and fear. "You've got no right." The older officer stepped forward first, calm but immovable. "Ma'am, We're here for a welfare check. Your daughter's been outside in the cold rain for some time. Karen's gaze darted toward the small shape on the porch, and then away, fast, like it burned to look too long. She needed to learn. She shot back. She slammed the door on me first. Talk back. You don't just let kids. You don't leave them to freeze. Rob cut him before he could stop himself. It wasn't loud, but it was edged with hours of held-in anger. Marta flinched, ready to calm him, but the older officer raised a hand, and Rob stopped. Karen's glare snapped to him. And who are you? You think you know better how to raise my child. I think I know cold when I see it, Rob answered, low and even. And fear. Behind him, the quiet circle murmured agreement, not shouting, just a wave of human sound. Phones came up a little higher, subtle but visible. Karen's eyes widened fractionally at that, the realization sinking that this wasn't one nosy neighbor, but an entire street bearing witness. The younger officer moved closer now, gentler in tone but no less firm. Ma'am, this is serious. The weather tonight could cause hypothermia, especially for a child this young. We'll need to ask some questions, and a medic is on the way. Karen's folded arms tightened like she could hold herself together with force alone. She's fine. You're all making a scene. Her voice cracked at the edges now, brittle anger fraying into something raw, shame maybe, or panic at losing control. She's not fine, Claire said quietly, finally standing but keeping one hand light on Lila's shoulder. Her tone wasn't confrontational, just matter of fact, the voice she used with frightened patience. I'm a nurse. Her hands are blue, her body temp is down. She's exhausted. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. Rain pattered into the gap where her protest should have been. In that moment, she looked not furious, but unmoored, a woman realizing how far the night had gone beyond her control. From a yard, someone said softly but clearly, "We saw everything." Another voice, it's recorded, not threats, just statements. Truth standing where it belonged. Karen's shoulders dropped an inch, almost imperceptibly. For the first time, her gaze fell fully on her daughter. Something flickered there, fear, guilt, old exhaustion, before she shuddered again and turned her eyes away. The older officer stepped slightly closer, body angled to keep the tension from sparking. "Let's keep this calm," he said, measured. "You can talk with us inside if you'd like. Our priority right now is your child's safety." Karen hesitated, torn between retreat and defiance. The weight of the rain, the silent faces, the phones, the fact that help had come, all of it seemed to press her back toward her own door. She glanced again at Marta kneeling protectively, at Rob's umbrella, at the strangers who had refused to leave. Marta didn't speak. She didn't move either. Her eyes just stayed on the woman who had opened and slammed and now stood wavering. It wasn't accusation in her gaze. It was something quieter but harder to withstand. Witnessing. Karen let out a sound, half sigh, half sob, barely audible under rain. Then she straightened, face hardening again, though less certain now. "Fine," she said, voice thin. "Talk inside if you need to, but she's my kid." "She's a child," Claire replied, even softer, but it landed heavier than any shout. Karen flinched and turned away, retreating just far enough for the older officer to follow her inside. The younger remained near the porch, eyes scanning the small gathering and then landing back on Lila. The rain kept falling, but its sound had changed, less oppressive now, more like white noise. The neighbors didn't cheer or move. They simply stood their ground, soaked and silent, a living record of the night's truth. Cameras lowered at last, but the quiet outrage in every face stayed plain. Marta tightened the coat around Lila and whispered something soft and soothing, not for the mother's ears, but for the child's. Rob shifted to block another gust of wind. Claire knelt again, one palm to a small shoulder. They weren't done yet, but they had brought the night this far, to light, to witness, to safety. Inside the doorway, light spilled unevenly onto the wet porch as the older officer stood just far enough back to keep things from feeling like a raid. His partner remained outside with the neighbors and the child, a quiet sentinel. The house smelled faintly of mildew and damp carpet every time the door swung wider, and that scent mingled with the rain's clean chill, a strange boundary between worlds. Karen hovered just beyond the threshold, still wrapped in anger like a threadbare coat. Her arms were crossed tight enough to cut off her own breathing. "You people don't understand," she started, voice sharp but shaking underneath. "She lies. She plays games. You think she's some poor little victim, but you don't know how she talks to me." The older officer didn't flinch. His voice was low and even, carrying the weight of practice. "Ma'am, right now our concern is not an argument. Our concern is your child's health and safety. The conditions tonight could have caused serious harm." Karen's chin lifted. "It's called discipline. Kids need to learn respect. My mother did worse, and I turned out fine." Rain hissed against the roof like static while her words hung there. Behind the officer, a single cough cut through from the waiting circle, not loud but pointed. Someone shifted and phones rose again, lenses aimed steady but unobtrusive. The quiet outrage was almost palpable. No yelling, no taunting, just a firm gaze of a street that had stayed and would keep staying. The officer stepped one pace closer, boots dripping onto the mat just inside. "I hear you," he said gently. "But leaving a child outside in near hypothermic conditions is considered neglect under state law. We're not here to humiliate you. We are here to protect her." Karen's breath hitched at the word neglect. For a second, her eyes darted past him to the porch where the child still sat swaddled. She looked so small under Marta's coat and the police blanket, smaller than she'd seemed when she slammed the door. That glance betrayed something, shame maybe, or the sudden realization that what was happening wasn't going back to normal, with a few hard words. "She wasn't out there that long," Karen said after a beat, but the conviction was fraying. She slammed the door on me. I needed her to know she couldn't." Her voice broke on the end of the sentence, crumbled under the weight of rain and eyes and cameras. The younger officer, still outside, spoke up for the first time, voice calm but edged with steel. Multiple witnesses saw her outside in heavy rain for over an hour. "We have video." She was already showing signs of hypothermia. Karen's gaze flicked to the phones beyond the porch. Jonah lowered his camera a fraction but didn't hide it. Neither did the others. The quiet wasn't hostile, but it was unyielding. It said, "We were here, we saw, we will not let this vanish." "She's my kid," Karen said again, but it sounded thinner now, a statement stripped of its earlier bite. "I can teach her." "No one's taking her role as parent," the older officer said gently. "But tonight went beyond teaching. Tonight put her in danger. That's why we're involved." Karen pressed a hand to her forehead, rainwater from the doorframe streaking her hair. She looked older suddenly, worn down by a night that had unraveled past her control. "You don't get how hard it is," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. Marta rose halfway, still protective but no longer crouched. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence was answer enough, a mother who'd chosen to act instead of argue. Claire stood too, one hand still resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, the quiet strength of a professional and a parent combined. The younger officer gestured subtly toward the child. "She needs medical evaluation. That's step one. After that, we'll talk resources, support, not just punishment. But tonight she has to be safe." Karen swayed slightly where she stood, torn between doubling down and collapsing. The word resources seemed to land differently, cutting through the defensive fog. She blinked hard, then looked away toward the dark hallway behind her, as if it might offer an escape. No one filled the silence for her. The street didn't jeer. The officers didn't push. They just waited, rain dripping in patient rhythm from umbrellas to porch. It was waiting of a different kind. Not the helpless kind, but the sort that leaves no room for denial. Finally, Karen exhaled, a rough, uneven sound. Her shoulders slumped an inch, arms loosening though not dropping. "She can see a medic," she muttered, almost inaudible. "Whatever." The older officer nodded once, not triumphant, just acknowledging the small crack in armor. "Thank you. That's a good first step." Outside, the neighbors didn't move closer or cheer. They stayed steady, witnesses to a fragile turning point. Jonah's phone lowered fully for the first time, though his eyes stayed sharp. Rob shifted the umbrella to shield Claire and the child better. Marta's hand returned to the small bundle in quiet reassurance. Claire bent and whispered something soft to Lila, who remained still but allowed the warmth of voices to reach her. The night didn't end with sirens blaring or arrests. It held to the slow rhythm of truth pressing forward against denial. The authority in uniforms was firm but quiet, and the greater authority, the collective, patient resolve of a neighborhood, held behind it like a tide. Rain kept falling, but it no longer washed the moment away. It marked it instead, a steady heartbeat of witness and care refusing to be silenced. Claire took her time before moving. She wanted Lila to feel the shift happen slowly, not like another abrupt thing in a night already full of shocks. The officers had stepped back a little, giving space. Marta still crouched nearby, hand light on the girl's shoulder. Rob angled the umbrella, so water slid harmlessly away. The porch boards gleamed with pooled rain, silver and trembling in the cruiser's headlights. Claire leaned closer and spoke, so quietly only Lila could hear. "We're going to get you warm now, sweetheart. Just a short ride. Safe people, safe place." She felt the child's small frame tense under the layers of coats, then loosened by a thread. Claire waited for that thread of trust to hold before she moved. Gently. She slipped her arms beneath the blanket bundle, careful to keep everything tucked close so cold air couldn't reach inside. Lila startled once, a sharp inhale and a shiver that ran through her whole body, but Claire whispered calm and steady, "I've got you. Just me. We'll be quick." Marta's hands hovered until she was sure the girl was secure, then drew back with a faint touch of encouragement. When Claire stood, Lila was almost weightless, but not in a way that felt good. Too light, too cold. Claire wrapped the bundle tighter with one elbow and used her other hand to hold the back of the girl's head against her shoulder. The child didn't cling, not yet, but she didn't fight either. That was enough. A patrol car door opened with a deep click, and a wash of warm light spilled across the wet yard, yellow and soft after so many hours of storm-gray darkness. It caught the rain in sudden gold threads and threw long shadows behind the neighbors. For the first time that night, the house behind them seemed less huge. The light belonged to someone else now, not the house, but safety arriving. The younger officer stood by the open door, one hand steady on the frame, the other ready to help. He didn't reach. He waited until Claire stepped forward. His voice matched hers, low, almost gentle. "We got blankets and heat inside. Medics will meet us." Claire nodded once, no wasted words, and climbed the porch steps down carefully, boots squeaking on slick wood. The small crowd parted to let her through. Neighbors shifted without speaking, umbrellas tilting away to make space. Some reached out just briefly, a hand brushing her arm, a quick squeeze to Marta's shoulder as she passed. No one clapped or spoke triumph. This was quiet work, Reverend. Jonah lowered his phone fully and simply watched, face pale but eyes alive with something like relief. Rob followed 2 paces behind until Claire reached the cruiser. He didn't say anything, just stayed close enough to block the rain. Marta came too, clutching her coat around herself now that its warmth had been given away. Claire bent and eased Lila into back seat, careful to keep her head supported. The officer waiting there had spread another thermal blanket across the seat, edges already tucked in to catch her small frame. As Claire settled her down, the child flinched once, then stilled. The doorframe light caught her face for a second, pale, wet lashes clumped, but eyes cracked open just enough to take in the new space. She didn't speak, but the tiniest breath of warmth fogged the window. Claire reached to adjust the seatbelt gently, never letting the belt touch bare skin. Just a cocoon of blankets. "Warm soon," she whispered one last time. "You're safe." Then she looked at the younger officer and nodded, satisfied enough to let go. He closed the door softly, not the jarring slam of before, but quiet, sure click. Inside, the back seat glowed with that soft dome light, while the heater's low hum filled the car. For the first time, the night felt like it might stop hurting. Marta pressed her palms together hard and exhaled, a sound halfway between prayer and exhaustion. Rob's shoulders sagged as if the weight he'd been holding finally shifted. Around them, the neighbors let out slow breaths, umbrellas lowering fractionally. Phones went back into pockets. Screens dimmed. Nobody needed evidence for this part. It was enough to see safety happen. Claire stood for a moment beside the closed door, rain dripping from her hood, hands still resting lightly on the window. Then she stepped back, letting the officers move in, one to talk softly through the cracked front window, the other to radio that the child was secure and warm. The house loomed silent behind them, but it no longer defined the night. Marta touched Claire's arm once, grateful and trembling. "Gracias," she whispered. Claire shook her head and managed a tired half-smile. She's alive. That's what matters. The cruiser's engine started, headlights cutting brighter lanes through the rain. The dome light in the back flicked off as the door sealed fully. Inside, Lila shifted under blankets, a tiny shape at last surrounded by warmth instead of cold. Neighbors didn't cheer, but a kind of exhale passed through them, a collective release after hours of breath held too long. Phones buzzed with quiet updates to those still inside. Asterisk, she's safe. She's warm. They're taking her to be checked. Asterisk. Claire turned back to the circle that remained and said simply, "Thank you for staying." The words hung in the wet air, true and heavy. No one answered at first, but few nodded. Some touched her shoulder or Marta's hand. It wasn't heroism anyone wanted. It was just what people do when they refuse to look away. Rain still fell, but softer now, its rhythm easing. The night wasn't over. There would be paperwork, questions, hard hours ahead for the girl. But for the first time, it felt survivable. A child was out of danger, out of the storm, in safe arms at last. And a street that had once been strangers had proven something quiet and unshakable. Witness can turn into rescue. When the cruiser eased away with its soft wash of light, the night seemed to breathe for the first time. Rain had slowed to a thin silver mist, still steady but gentler, like the storm itself had tired. The last reflection of taillights slid across puddles and was gone. All that remained was a house, tall, wet-sided, with its porch lamp burning a weak yellow glow. Karen stood there for a long second in the doorway, still framed in the harsh interior light, and the eyes of the neighborhood stayed on her without a word. She looked out over them, face pale now rather than angry, but still guarded. Her arms hung stiff at her sides, fingers twitching once as if she might speak, might demand something, but the words never came. Perhaps it was the cameras still up at the edges, though most were lowered now. Perhaps it was a simple weight of presence, not a mob, not hostility, just steady watchfulness that said we know what happened. Whatever it was. She swallowed hard, looked away, and without another sound stepped back into the house. The door shut slowly this time. No slam, but not gentle either. A careful, self-protective closing. The sound clicked across the wet yard, small but final enough that everyone felt it. Not triumph. Nothing about this night felt like winning, but a strange, heavy settling. Marta hugged her damp coat close and stared at the door until the porch light flickered and went out. Rob exhaled, long and low, and let the umbrella sag at last. Water poured off its edge and splashed onto the ground. Claire was still standing where the patrol car had been, eyes distant, rain glinting on her lashes. She didn't look at Karen's house. She looked at the street itself, as though memorizing the shapes of people who had stayed. One by one, neighbors began to shift. Someone checked their phone and murmured, "She's safe at the station, medic on scene." Another whispered down the line until Marta heard, and Marta sagged with relief. A few people nodded to each other, small respectful acknowledgments, then turned slowly toward their homes. No chatter, no gossip, just a quiet drift of people returning to their own doors with heads full of the night. Jonah and Eli stayed at their window. Pale faces pressed the glass until their mother appeared behind them. She didn't scold, not now. She just touched each boy's shoulder and guided them back into the warm light of their room. Jonah's phone was finally dark, video saved, battery long dead. He didn't need to film anymore. Out on the sidewalk, the man in the red parka tipped his hood back to wipe rain from his face. "Guess that's it for now," he said softly, to no one in particular. Rob answered with a quiet, "Yeah," but didn't move yet. Marta didn't either. She and Rob stood together for another minute, silent but not alone, each knowing the other had been there when it mattered. Claire was the last to move. She turned once toward the darkened porch, then toward Marta and Rob. "I'll check on her," she said, not as a boast but as a promise. I know where they'll take her for evaluation. I'll make sure someone's with her until family or services step in." Marta nodded, too tired to speak, but grateful beyond measure. Somewhere up the block, a door shut gently. Another porch light clicked off. The street was returning to itself, but it felt different now. Less anonymous, the way a place does after strangers have worked together without needing to plan. People would still argue tomorrow about boundaries, about when to step in and when to hold back. But tonight the argument had answered itself. Claire walked Marta halfway home before turning down her own path. Rob lingered at the curb another minute, looking back once more at Karen's house. Its windows glowed faintly now, like eyes half-lidded, giving nothing away. Then he turned and disappeared into the mist. Inside warm kitchens, phones buzzed with a new kind of message. Some were short, "She's safe." Some longer, typed with shaking hands. Asterisk, "Couldn't just watch." "Proud of you all." Asterisk links started to circulate quietly. Local outlets already catching wind of what had happened. Someone must have sent Jonah's clip or part of it to the chat admin. It had moved faster than anyone expected. Child locked out in storm. Neighbors intervene. Headlines in draft form already glowing on screens before the night fully ended. People debated whether sharing was right, whether it would help or harm. But even those who argued felt the current. This story was leaving Maple Street now. Marta reached her kitchen and found her husband waiting, worried and wordless. She let him take her wet coat, then leaned against the counter until her knees steadied. In another house, Rob toweled off and sat alone for a while, staring at nothing. Claire put her boots on the mat and sat on the stairs, head in her hands for just a moment before going to check on her own sleeping child. Outside, Maple Street finally quieted. Rain kept falling, softer, like memory rather than punishment. The Doyle house stood still and silent. Light seeping from one upstairs window, but no shadows moving behind it. There would be no victory banner, no easy ending. Only the fact that a child had been pulled from a night too cold and too long. Because enough people chose not to stay behind curtains. And now the story was leaving their hands, traveling outward in headlines and whispers. Maybe to shame, maybe to warn, maybe to help someone else somewhere make a different choice. But here for now, the streets simply exhaled. One by one, houses tucked back into themselves, not forgetting but resting. The last porch light clicked off. The night was no longer safe or perfect, but had been seen, and that at least would matter in the morning. By the time the rain finally eased into a thin mist and Maple Street settled back into its uneasy quiet, another current had already left the neighborhood and begun moving far faster than anyone standing in that yard could follow. Jonah's video, the shaky, grainy clip that had lived only in a private group chat, slipped loose from its small circle before midnight. It wasn't deliberate at first. Someone forwarded it to a cousin just to show what happened. Someone else sent it to a friend on another street. A teacher in the chat asked if she could share with a colleague who knew how to report child neglect. Each small decision felt harmless in the moment, but on the internet, small spreads wide without asking. By 11:48 p.m., the clip had been reposted to a local community safety group on social media. The post was simple: "Asterisk, this happened on Maple Street tonight." Police responded, "Child is safe now, but this is what neighbors saw." Asterisk, a video autoplayed for anyone scrolling. Lila's small bundled shape under rain. Marta leaning in with her coat. Rob's umbrella held steady. Claire's calm voice somewhere off camera, and then the slice of warm light from the door. Karen's voice sharp. "She needs to learn," followed by the slam. The audio was rough but unmistakable. Within minutes, reactions poured in. Sad faces, angry emojis, long comment from strangers who didn't know Maple Street at all but knew enough. How can any parent think this is okay? Good for those neighbors, real heroes. Asterisk, where were the police? Why so long? Asterisk, screenshots of the video spread, then links to news tips. By 12:15 a.m., it was on a regional breaking news feed. Child locked outside during storm. Neighbors intervene. A photo pulled from the video. Umbrellas and raincoats clustered on a porch serve as a stark image. Inside Maple homes, phones began buzzing again, this time with notifications beyond the chat. Marta's teenage son came to the kitchen, holding his phone out, wide-eyed. "Mom, it's everywhere." She blinked at the headline on his screen, so tired she couldn't form a response. In Rob's house, his grown daughter texted, "Dad, is that you?" followed by a string of shocked emojis. Claire's hospital group thread pinged with a message from a co-worker on night shift. Asterisk, "Saw your street on my feed. You okay?" Asterisk. Jonah sat on his bed staring at the number of views climbing faster than he could count. His stomach twisted, pride and unease tangling. He hadn't meant for it to go wide. He just wanted truth to exist in case someone lied later. Eli sat cross-legged beside him, whispering updates as if narrating a game. 2,000 views. 3,000. Jonah rubbed his forehead. "I didn't mean to." "You helped," Eli said firmly, though his voice trembled a little. "She's safe." Outside their room, their mother fielded calls from friends who'd seen the clip. She wasn't angry, not after tonight, but she looked stunned by how fast a private moment could become public. On social media, the debate burned hotter than it had in the group chat hours earlier. Some commenters were furious with Karen by name, since her identity was already out. Others begged for caution, saying the child's privacy mattered. "Protect the kid," one post pleaded, but thanked those neighbors for stepping up. Local reporters reached out to anyone they could identify. A few messages landed in Marta's inbox before she turned her phone face down. Rob ignored unknown calls. Claire didn't answer at all. She had long since powered her phone off after tucking her own daughter back to sleep. But even with the swirl of digital noise, something quieter wove through the chaos. Affirmation. Strangers hundreds of miles away wrote things like, "This is what a community should do." And to whoever held that umbrella, "Thank you." Parents admitted they'd pause mid-scroll to check on their own sleeping kids. People shared resources for recognizing neglect, for calling welfare checks, for not staying silent. There was anger, yes, some ugly, some righteous, but threaded through was a larger call that felt like light breaking through cloud. Asterisk, see something. Do something. Protect children. Asterisk. On Maple Street, the houses glowed from within while the outside world roared on screens. Marta sat at her kitchen table wrapped in a dry blanket, her husband across from her, both too spent to speak. She scrolled once, saw strangers arguing over her name, and shut the phone again. It wasn't about recognition. Tonight had been about one girl not freezing alone. Jonah, upstairs, finally set his phone aside and whispered to Eli, "I just want her safe." Eli nodded solemnly. "She is." Neither boy slept easily, but when they finally drifted off, it was to the muted hum of their mother answering another friend who called just to say, "Proud of your kids." Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing rain and echoing Karen's voice in her mind. But under that echo lived another, the sound of neighbors stepping forward, of quiet decisions gathering force until rescue happened. Somewhere far beyond their little street, headlines refreshed, shares multiplied, strangers argued. But inside the houses where it began, the night was ending slowly, heavy but steadier. What had started as a child's desperate knocks had become something louder than anger, stronger than fear, a living proof that ordinary people can refuse to turn away. And though the digital world will move on to the next outcry soon enough, for Maple Street the story was still close and human. A girl safe, a community awake, and a promise, wordless but deep, that silence will not have the last word. Dawn broke slow and colorless, the kind of pale gray morning that usually makes Maple Street feel safe and ordinary again. But when Marta opened her curtains, she didn't see ordinary. She saw 2 white vans with satellite dishes rising like strange new trees, and a cluster of strangers in heavy jackets, sipping coffee from paper cups while cameras rested on tripods. Microphones with bright foam heads waited in hands. The quiet street that had always belonged to families and joggers and mail trucks now belonged, for a while at least, to the news. Her first instinct was to close the curtain and pretend she hadn't looked, but the memory of last night was too fresh. She left the curtain cracked and watched as more vehicles rolled in, a sedan with a small station logo on its door, then another van backing carefully against the curb. Bright lights flicked on against the gray, cutting long, artificial beams across wet pavement still slick from the storm. Neighbors who usually lingered over coffee before work were already at their windows, some peeking through blinds, some stepping onto porches in slippers. At Rob's house, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He groaned and reached for it, then sat up fast when he saw the missed calls. Local numbers he didn't know, a voicemail from a reporter asking for comment. He ignored it and went to the window instead. Sure enough, a camera crew was setting up near his driveway. He swore softly under his breath and reached for his flannel shirt, feeling suddenly exposed. He hadn't done any of this for cameras. He'd done it because a child had been freezing 5 feet from his house. Jonah and Eli were up earlier than usual, still in pajamas, whispering while watching the scene from their attic window. "That's Channel 9, Jonah murmured, pointing at a familiar logo. "That's National," Eli said, eyes wide at a network truck. Their mother swept into the room and gently tugged the curtains half closed. "You too. No interviews," she said firmly. "Not today." Jonah nodded, secretly relieved but also strangely guilty. His video had started this flood. Marta made herself a cup of tea before stepping out onto her porch. She didn't plan to talk, just needed air. But the instant she opened the door, a young reporter with perfect hair and a plastic smile moved fast across the yard. Camera operator behind. "Mrs. Alvarez? Are you the neighbor who?" Marta shook her head quickly, raising a hand. "No interviews. Please." The reporter tried again, softer this time. "Can you just tell us how the child's doing?" Marta only said, "Safe? That's all I know," before retreating back inside, heart pounding. She hated how foreign it felt to be treated like a headline. At Claire's house, the phone had been buzzing since sunrise. Colleagues checking if she needed support. Friends sending links to the story as it aired on morning shows. She peeked out once and saw 3 vans parked across from the Doyles. Cameras aimed loosely at the house, as though the front door might break news by itself. Karen's curtain stayed drawn, her car still in the driveway. A lone cameraman adjusted his lens toward that silent house, and Claire's stomach turned. She wanted to keep Lila invisible, not part of the spectacle. Rob finally went out to get his paper and was immediately approached by a pair of reporters. "Mr. Givens, can you tell us what happened?" one asked. Rob hesitated at the end of his walkway, rain boots in mud, and answered with quiet weight. "A child needed help. We helped. That's all." When they pushed for more, he shook his head, voice low but firm. "She's just a kid. Don't make her story bigger than she already had to live." The street itself felt different, awake but defensive. Neighbors waved at one another with brief nods, small solidarity in the face of cameras. Parents ushered kids out earlier than usual, shielding faces with backpacks or hands. A few doors down, an older man planted himself on his porch chair like a silent guard, glaring until one camera swung away. Still, headlines grew beyond their control. Phones buzzed with links to national morning shows using the footage. Asterisk, neighborhood saves girl left out in storm. Asterisk, hashtag started a trend. Commentators praised community action. Others debated parenting and privacy. Some posts blurred the child's image. Others didn't. That detail gnawed at Claire, though she was too tired to fight the internet itself. By mid-morning, the officers who responded returned briefly, checking in and reassuring neighbors that child services was involved. One paused to thank Marta and Rob quietly before climbing back into the cruiser. Their presence calmed some of the unease, but couldn't stop the media tide. Marta turned her phone off after one too many calls from unknown numbers. She sat at her table with tea gone cold, trying to hold on to the memory of last night before it became something consumed and repackaged by strangers. Across the way, Rob did the same in his kitchen, newspaper untouched on the counter. Claire, still in her scrubs from a night too short, typed a single message to the neighborhood chat. Asterisk, remember, we acted because we saw a child. Don't let the cameras make it about anything else. Asterisk. On Maple Street, the day brightened slowly but uneasily. Trucks hummed. Reporters rehearsed stand-ups about ordinary heroes. Inside, the people who had stood in the rain felt anything but heroic. They felt protective, raw, and weary. They had no script for what to say when the world came knocking. All they had was a truth they'd lived, A small girl in danger, a community that refused to look away, and a long, wet night that belonged, first and always, to her safety, not to headlines. The television vans had begun pulling away by late morning, but before the street could exhale fully, a plain sedan rolled up. No logos, no cameras, just a quiet presence with state plates. Two people stepped out, a woman in a navy raincoat carrying a canvas satchel stuffed with folders, and a man balancing a laptop case under one arm. No broadcast gear, no flashing lights, just an air of deliberate calm. Those who had kept watch through the long night knew at once that this was different. These were not reporters. These were the people who come after the headlines, the ones tasked with turning last night's chaos into process. They didn't knock on random doors. The pair went straight to Karen's house, the woman leading, her expression unreadable but not harsh. Rob, watering his driveway more out of nerves than necessity, stepped aside and watched them go. Marta, peeking between curtains, whispered to her husband, "Child services." Her stomach clenched again. She had wanted help for the girl, but this felt heavier, permanent. The front door opened after a long pause. Karen stood there, hair still damp from last night, or maybe from a hurried shower, face pale and wary. She looked nothing like the fierce figure from the storm. Now she seemed cornered and small. But she didn't slam the door. She let them in. That small surrender sent a wave of quiet across Maple Street. Claire watched from her porch steps, arms wrapped around herself. She was off shift but still in her hospital scrubs, waiting in case someone needed to talk. Her phone buzzed, a message from a colleague at Lila's school. "Just heard. Counselor heading there now." Claire typed back, "Asterisk good. She'll need a familiar face." Asterisk. An hour passed. Neighbors went about slow versions of normal life. Coffee mugs, errands, kids reluctantly to school, but eyes flicked often toward the Doyle house. Some part of them stayed tethered to what they'd witnessed. Every so often, the curtains in Karen's living room shifted. Once, the door opened briefly and the navy-coated woman stepped onto the porch to make a phone call, voice low and professional. By midday, another car arrived, this one with the school district seal on its door. A woman in her 30s got out, carrying a slim leather folder and a small tote. Claire recognized her instantly. Ms. Carter, the elementary counselor. She'd worked with kids from hard homes before, gentle but unsparing when needed. Claire felt a knot of relief loosen. Someone who already knew Lila, or at least her file, was coming into the loop. Ms. Carter didn't stride up like a stranger. She paused at the walkway and spoke with the child services team first. They formed a small cluster under the thin drizzle, heads bent, paperwork exchanged. Then they disappeared inside together. Through the brief open door, Marta caught a glimpse. Karen on the couch, rigid but silent. Lila nowhere visible, perhaps tucked elsewhere. Inside, the work was methodical. Paperwork, interviews, photographs. The woman in navy asked careful, plain questions. Health, school attendance, family support. The man tapped steady notes into his laptop. Ms. Carter spoke softly, but Karen's voice carried now and then, defensive at first, then breaking into long pauses. There was no shouting. The sharp edges of last night had dulled into exhausted explanations, thin and halting. Outside, the street stayed respectfully distant. People who'd stood in the rain now hung laundry or swept porches, but their presence was deliberate. Quiet support if needed, watchfulness without intrusion. Rob kept glancing up each time a car slowed. Marta sent one message into the chat. Asterisk officials here. Keep distance, let them work. Asterisk, everyone seemed to understand. Claire finally went inside but left her door open, listening. She thought about the questions child services would ask. History of neglect, discipline practices, family stressors. She wondered if Karen would fight or fold, and if there was anyone else in that house who could help change its shape. More than anything, she hoped someone would follow through beyond paperwork. Real welfare checks, not just a file closed when headlines fade. When the team emerged hours later, the sky had brightened to a weak, watery blue. Ms. Carter walked with the state workers to their cars. Faces serious, but not grim. They didn't make announcements. Still, everyone watching understood something had shifted. Oversight had arrived, and oversight meant accountability. Karen stepped onto the porch behind them for just a moment. She didn't wave. She looked out at the street with eyes that were hard to read. Part shame, part resentment, part something heavier that might have been regret. Then she retreated inside again and closed the door, gently this time. No slam, no declaration. The plain sedan pulled away, followed by Ms. Carter's car. The neighborhood chat buzzed cautiously. Investigation started. School involved. Follow-ups promised. People expressed relief but also weariness. No one was celebrating. There was a sober understanding that this wasn't fixed by one night, but it was no longer hidden. Marta finally stepped out for mail and caught Rob doing the same. They met halfway, words unnecessary but exchanged anyway. She's in the system now, Rob said quietly. Marta nodded. Good. But poor kid. They stood there a minute in the damp street. Two neighbors linked by something bigger than a single storm. Inside their homes, others did the same, watched, whispered updates, returned to quiet lives a little less private, a little more awake. The night's choice to step out and stay had drawn lines that would not easily fade. And somewhere beyond their view, in a warm office or a social worker's car, a file with Lila's name had been started. Not just paper, but a record that said she was seen. The next morning the rain had stopped, but Maple Street still carried the scent of it. Wet pavement, soaked lawns, the faint metallic tang that lingers after a storm. The quiet felt different now. Not peaceful, but watchful, heavy with what had happened. Neighbors moved slower than usual, waving half-heartedly, eyes lingering a little longer when they passed one another. There were conversations waiting to happen, and also ones people wished they could avoid. Marta was one of the first outside, sweeping small sticks and leaves from her porch, though she had no reason to be out there. She looked across at Rob's house and found him already on his steps, coffee in hand, staring into the distance. Their eyes met. No wave, just recognition. It was the kind of look that said, "We were there, we'll remember." She almost crossed the talk, but didn't yet know what to say. At the far end of the block, the teen brothers had been up since dawn. Jonas sat on the curb, hood up, phone in his lap, but screen dark. Eli plopped down beside him with a cereal bar, chewing quietly. "It's weird," Jonas said finally. "Everyone online is calling us heroes." He sounded uncomfortable, like the word didn't fit. Eli shrugged. "We just didn't pretend." Jonah nodded but didn't smile. "I almost didn't film," he admitted. Almost didn't want to get involved. He didn't add how guilty that almost felt now. Across the street, Ms. Daniels, the nurse, was hanging a fresh pair of scrubs on a line to dry. She'd been up half the night after helping with Lila, and then getting calls from her hospital about the video. She was exhausted but couldn't stop replaying the moment she hesitated at her phone before calling non-emergency dispatch. "I should have dialed sooner," she muttered to herself, though she'd acted long before anyone else. Her husband came out with coffee and touched her shoulder. "You did something," he said. "That's what counts." Other households were quieter, hiding behind curtains, not out of malice but shame. One neighbor who had typed "not our business" in the chat last night hadn't left their house at all this morning. Another man who'd watched from behind his blinds now swept furiously, head down, as if clearing leaves could scrub away guilt. People had been reminded that doing nothing is still a choice, and that choice would live with them. Claire walked slowly down the sidewalk, hands deep in her jacket pockets. She'd spent the night half awake, turning over scenes in her head. The moment she'd stepped forward, the moment Karen had cracked the door, she didn't feel heroic either. She felt sobered, aware of how thin the line had been between stepping out and staying safe inside. How easy it is to justify silence until a life is slipping away on your doorstep. At mid-morning, Marta's husband suggested inviting a few neighbors over for coffee. "Just to decompress," he said, unsure. Marta hesitated but agreed. By noon, a handful gathered in her living room. Rob, Claire, Ms. Daniels, the teen boys and their mother, even the man from the red parka who'd quietly filmed part of the night. They didn't have an agenda. They just sat, damp coats hung on hooks, mugs steaming. It started awkwardly. Rob broke the silence first. "Last night scared the hell out of me." Ms. Daniels nodded. Me too, Claire admitted. I was second from staying inside. Kept thinking, not my business. Marta winced and whispered, I almost did too, until I saw her shivering. Jonas shifted, eyes on his shoes. I thought filming was nosy, but now I'm glad. His mother put a hand on his shoulder, wordless but proud. They spoke quietly for a long time. No speeches, no neat wrap-ups. Just raw confessions and what-ifs. Ms. Daniels mentioned how hard it is to know when to call. Rob worried about things escalating. Marta said she'd learned to trust her gut more than her fear of overstepping. Claire said she'd never again doubt the instinct to step outside when something felt wrong. Someone suggested maybe the block should have better contact info for emergencies, beyond just a chat that turns into debate. Another said they could check on kids if something looked off, not with accusation but care. They weren't planning a formal watch, just a net of eyes willing to look and hearts willing to act. Outside that small circle, the reckoning took other forms. Parents talked differently at dinner tables, about safety, about kindness, about not turning away. Social media debates went on, but closer to home it was quieter and heavier. Less about anger at Karen, more about self-examination. People asked themselves hard questions. Would I have stood in the rain? Would I have cracked my door? Late afternoon, Marta stepped out with leftover coffee cake for the Daniels family. On her way back, she caught sight of the not our business neighbor finally stepping out, looking tentative and embarrassed. Marta surprised herself by offering a small nod instead of glare. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was an invitation. Maybe next time they'd join instead of hide. By evening, the street was still uneasy but different. Not triumphant, not united in some grand way, but stitched together by thin new threads of responsibility. They all understood something they hadn't before. Communities are built in the smallest, hardest moments, when you decide to act even while afraid. Inside her kitchen, Claire texted the chat one more time. Asterisk, let's check in on each other sometimes. Not just when there's trouble. Asterisk hearts reacted. Thumbs up followed. No plan but a start. The storm was over, but its echo remained, a quiet inventory each person took of their own courage and fear. Some would feel proud when they looked back. Some would feel the sting of having almost done nothing. But all of them had seen what can happen when enough choose witness over silence. And none of them would forget how fast a single porch and a child's cry could change the shape of a street. The drive out of Maple Street had been silent, the tires humming on wet roads while the heater blew steady and soft. Lila sat bundled in layers of blankets in the back seat, small face half hidden, eyes darting only occasionally to the passing lights. The younger officer kept his voice quiet, explaining where they were going in pieces gentle enough not to frighten. A relative, safe for now, somewhere warm and close, but not this house. Lila didn't answer, just held her torn backpack tight. The strap wrapped twice around her wrist as if to anchor herself. By the time they reached the small yellow house at the edge of Briar Hollow, dawn was leaning in pale against the hills. The air still smelled of wet earth, but the storm had gone. A porch light flicked on as they pulled up, not glaring, just a soft glow that looked like invitation. Aunt Miriam was already waiting in the doorway, a shawl thrown over her shoulders, hair tied back in a quick braid. She was small and spare, but her presence filled the threshold with quiet steadiness. She didn't rush when the officers helped Lila out of the car. She stepped forward slowly, eyes meeting the child's before anything else. "Hey, baby," she said, voice low and warm but not too bright. "You okay to come inside?" Lila hesitated, but when Miriam crouched slightly and extended her hand, palm up, not grabbing, the girl's fingers found their way into it after a long pause. No speeches, no forced hugs, just the first human contact of the morning. Inside smelled of toast and something sweet. A small wood stove clicked in the corner, and a kettle whispered on the back burner. Miriam had clearly been up for hours, blankets stacked neatly on the couch, a mug of cocoa waiting, a plate with sliced apples and peanut butter set out like she thought about what might be gentle on an empty, scared stomach. The officers followed quietly, explaining a few things in murmured tones. Temporary placement, paperwork starting, follow-ups coming. Miriam nodded, her face calm but her hand never leaving Lila's shoulder. Lila didn't speak as she was guided to a chair near the stove. She perched on the edge at first, wet sneakers squeaking faintly on the linoleum. Miriam didn't fuss but went to the kitchen, returning with a soft towel and kneeling to untie the laces, peeling damp socks away. "We'll get you dry," she murmured. "No rush." The girl's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. When Miriam wrapped her feet in the towel and tucked them onto a braided rug, something shifted. A tiny loosening of shoulders. Breakfast wasn't fancy. Toast with honey, scrambled eggs, a banana sliced and fanned out on a small plate. But after the long, cold night, the smell alone seemed to fill the room with safety. Lila ate slowly, first bites tiny and cautious, then a little faster when no one hurried her. Miriam kept her own plate untouched, watching without staring, letting the child's hunger set the pace. When the food was gone, the officers said their goodbyes, making sure Lila knew where they'd be and how to reach them if she got scared. One of them bent a little to meet her eyes. "You're safe here," he said softly. "We'll check on you." She gave a small nod, the first clear acknowledgement since leaving the porch on Maple Street. Then the door shut behind them, and the house fell into a silence that wasn't threatening, just soft and new. Miriam cleared plates and then sat at the table across from Lila. She didn't ask questions. She just started talking gently about ordinary things. "Storm's done. Chickens will be glad. You like animals?" After a long, quiet moment, Lila whispered, "Cats." Miriam smiled the faintest smile. "Good. We've got one. His name's Oliver. He's shy, but maybe you'll meet him later." That small thread of conversation hung in the warm air, fragile but real. It wasn't therapy or deep talk. It was a sound of a life not entirely broken, just paused and slowly stitching. Miriam fetched a clean t-shirt and sweatpants from a neatly folded stack she prepared. "No tags," she said softly, noticing Lila's wary glance. "Soft seams." The girl's eyes flicked up, surprised that someone had thought of that. Later, Miriam showed her the small spare room. Quilt folded back, a single lamp glowing, a stuffed rabbit waiting at the foot of the bed, though Miriam would never say it was new. She just let it be there in case. Lila stood in the doorway for a long while, gripping the backpack. Finally, she stepped in and set it carefully on the dresser. By mid-morning, the house had fallen into a rhythm. Miriam made tea and moved quietly through her chores. Lila curled on a quilt, half dozing, one hand on the stuffed rabbit's ear. Oliver the cat eventually appeared, silent as a ghost, and settled near the end of the bed. Lila's small fingers twitched once, brushing fur, and the cat stayed. It was the first thing to stay with her all night. Outside, the world churned news feeds, debates, paperwork. But inside the little yellow house, there was just warmth and the smell of tea. Miriam understood this was only a pause. Decisions about custody, services, therapy would come. But she also knew the first thing a child needs after surviving cold is proof that warmth exists. She didn't need to fix everything today. She only needed to make safe real and solid. And so she did, by laying out dry clothes, by letting breakfast linger, by giving the gift of silence when silence was what the child could handle. Lila didn't say much, but when Miriam quietly asked if she liked more cocoa, there was a soft nod. It was enough. A beginning small and quiet, but safe. The storm was long gone by the time Maple Street found a new rhythm. Weeks had passed. Mornings came with softer light, and lawns dried enough for children to ride bikes again. Yet no one who'd been there that night looked at the Doyle house the same way. Some days it seemed just another weathered home with a porch swing and peeling trim. Other days it was still the place where a door had stayed shut too long. But life doesn't hold still, and slowly the street began weaving something different out of what had happened. It started small. One Saturday morning, Jonah and Eli dragged a battered piece of plywood from their garage. They propped it against sawhorses and began painting with leftover house paint. Thick, uneven letters in bright blue and white, until the words were clear enough to read from the road. Kids deserve safe homes. The paint dripped and the O's were crooked, but it was bold. Their mother came out halfway through with lemonade, raised an eyebrow but didn't stop them. "You sure you want to put that out front?" she asked. Jonah nodded without looking up. "Yeah, people should remember." She didn't argue. By afternoon, the sign was planted in the small patch of grass near the curb, not directly facing the Doyle house, but visible from anywhere on the block. Some neighbors slowed as they passed. Marta came out with her husband and stared for a while before giving a small thumbs up. Rob wandered over later and helped the boys stake it deeper, so the wind wouldn't take it. He didn't say much, just patted Eli's shoulder and went back to his porch. Soon other signs and quiet gestures appeared. Claire, still haunted but hopeful, taped a laminated page to the community board at the end of the street. Phone numbers for child welfare checks, non-emergency police, and a few local parenting resources. She wrote at the top in her careful handwriting, *, see something, say something, and stay. * Marta put a wicker box on her porch marked Little Library. Little help. Stocked with children's coats, gloves, and paperbacks. People added to it quietly at night. Scarves, extra lunchboxes, warm socks. On a cool Friday evening, Marta texted the chat. Coffee and cocoa on my porch tomorrow. Come if you want to talk. She didn't know if anyone would. But the next day, folding chairs began to appear. First Rob with his big thermos. Then Ms. Daniels carrying a tray of cookies. Then families with kids shyly trailing behind. Even the man who typed "not our business" weeks before came, shoulders hunched, and took a silent seat near the back. No one mocked him. Everyone had learned something about fear and choice. Conversation flowed slowly, cautious at first, but warming with mugs and shared memory. Ms. Daniels spoke about the moment she almost didn't call, how easy it is to wait and second-guess. Rob admitted he'd worried about crossing lines, but decided a child's life mattered more than discomfort. Jonah surprised everyone by speaking up, voice cracking but clear, about why he filmed and how scared he'd been to push send. I thought it would just sit in our chat, he said, eyes fixed on his hands. I didn't think all this. His mother squeezed his shoulder and whispered it mattered. Claire shared something that quieted the whole group. I'm trained to respond to emergencies at work, she said softly. But at home, I almost convinced myself to stay inside. I won't make that mistake again. Heads nodded around the circle, relief and shared guilt weaving into resolve. They talked about boundaries, how to help without turning into vigilantes, how to call for help when things feel wrong. Marta suggested more contact info on the chat. Who's home at night? Who's willing to check on a child alone outside? Ms. Daniels offered to teach basic hypothermia signs after work one day. Nothing formal, no new committee, just a quiet pact to be better neighbors. While they talked, Lila's name didn't come up often, but she was there in every pause, every careful word. They all knew she was still with Aunt Miriam for now. Claire had quietly updated Marta that the child was safe and attending school again. That knowledge hung like a small light at the center of their gathering. She had warmth and routine again. As dusk fell, lanterns blinked on across porches. The kids, Jonah, Eli, and a few others, kicked a soccer ball down the middle of the street, their laughter bouncing off houses that had once been closed and dark. Even the not our business neighbor stood watching, hands deep in pockets, a look on his face that said he understood the second chance this moment offered. When the gathering broke apart, Marta noticed how people lingered longer than usual, reluctant to retreat behind doors. There were promises to check in, to share phone numbers, to walk together after dark. Not loud promises, just small, practical ones that felt stronger than hashtags. Later that night, Jonah sat on his porch steps staring at the crooked sign he and Eli had made. It glowed faintly under the streetlight, paint streaks visible but proud. He felt something he hadn't since that awful night. Not guilt, not fear, but a steady, quiet pride. He hadn't planned to be brave, but maybe bravery is just deciding you can't stand by. Across the street, Rob turned out his porch light, but not before giving the sign one last glance. Marta watched from her window and smiled faintly, then went to bed knowing the street she lived on was different now, awake in ways it hadn't been before. No one called it healing. Not yet, but there was a new readiness, a network of watchful eyes and open doors, born from one terrible night, and one small girl who knocked and was finally answered. By early spring, the story was gone from the front pages. Other outrages and miracles had taken its place. The scrolling feeds that once carried Jonah's shaky video now moved on to storm somewhere else. New tragedies, new debates. The vans had long since rolled away. and the cameras never returned. But Maple Street never went fully back to what it was. News might leave, but memory clung like rain-soaked wood. You could feel it in small, nearly invisible ways. People opened their curtains sooner in the morning, eyes scanning the sidewalks the way you check a yard after a heavy wind. When kids waited for the bus and drizzle, there were always extra umbrellas leaning from doorways, hands waving them over without hesitation. The neighborhood chat changed its tone. Where once someone might have typed, "not our business," now there was a reflexive asterisk, "is that safe? Should we check?" Asterisk, and no one mocked the question. The Doyle house itself remained quiet. Karen still lived there. Sometimes she left early and returned late, head down, no greeting. No one jeered or whispered loudly when she passed. There was a complicated mercy in the street's silence toward her. Not approval, not forgetting, but boundary that said, "You're seen and we'll watch, but we won't destroy you." Some believed she was in counseling. Others didn't ask. The important thing was that Lila wasn't invisible anymore. She stayed with Aunt Miriam for months, came back only for short visits, escorted and smiling shyly when she did. The first time she appeared on the street again, walking with Miriam, the air shifted. People didn't swarm her. They just nodded gently, let her see the quiet watchfulness in their faces. It was enough. Jonah and Eli's sign weathered badly in the weeks that followed. The paint peeled and the plywood warped, but no one dared remove it. When spring sun finally broke through, Rob helped him repaint it on sturdier boards. The letters stayed uneven, but the color was bolder this time, deep sky blue on crisp white. He drilled it into the ground himself. Boots in the thawing earth, a small ritual of keeping the vow alive. Now anyone driving down Maple Street saw it before they saw house numbers. Kids deserve safe homes. Claire noticed other shifts when she went back to work. Parents in town asked more pointed questions during pediatric checkups, about signs of hypothermia, about when to call someone. Teachers swapped phone numbers more freely with neighbors. Ms. Carter from the school sent home a flyer about resources for stressed families. It wasn't flashy, but people kept on fridges. Marta said the change showed in how doors open now. One rainy afternoon, she found a neighbor's toddler toddling too close to the curb. Before she could even step off her porch, 3 other doors opened and voices called. "You okay, sweetheart?" No one hesitated. They didn't ask permission first. They acted. On the first anniversary of the storm, no one organized anything official. Still, a quiet current moved. Marta left a thermos of cocoa on her porch with a note for watchers in the rain. Rob placed a single lantern by the sign and let it burn until morning. Claire texted the chat a simple message. Asterisk, remember we said not here. Still true. Asterisk hearts and check marks filled the thread, brief but strong. What lingered most was not the outrage, but the quiet rule that had been written without a vote. If a child knocks, if a child cries, if a child is outside in the dark and cold, you open the door. You don't wait for permission. You don't debate while minutes stretch. You go. It didn't make Maple Street perfect. Arguments still happened. Gossip still flared. But behind those human frictions lived a sharper instinct. One night's hard-won clarity about what matters. People knew what it cost to do nothing. They watched a girl nearly disappear into cold and fear, and they'd felt the relief of pulling her back. That stays. Lila's name rarely came up now, but sometimes when the weather turned and rain swept across porches, someone would glance at the Doyle house and at the crooked blue sign and remember. Jonah, taller now, would still sometimes pause on curb, earbuds out, scanning. Marta still kept the wicker box stocked. Claire still looked up each time a car slowed near the bus stop. The world might have moved on, but here the story had settled into the grain of the place. It didn't need headlines to keep breathing. It lived in choices made quietly, doors that cracked open faster, hands that reached without debate. It lived in neighbors who knew that even if cameras never came back, they could still matter in the moment that counts. And on nights when rain drums on the roofs, someone, Marta, Rob, maybe one of the boys grown a little braver, will look out and think of the child who once sat alone on the cold steps. They'll whisper, maybe only to themselves, the unwritten promise Maple Street now holds. Not here, not again.